The world you live in is loud, even when it pretends to be quiet. So for a moment, let the noise fall away. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the air in the room feel a little older, like it has been waiting for you to notice it. Tonight, we are not chasing answers. We are walking slowly beside questions, the kind that do not demand proof in order to feel true. Questions that behave like distant stars, guiding you without ever needing to touch the ground. Some places on Earth feel like they belong to time. Antarctica is one of them. Not because it is empty, but because it is sealed. A continent turned into a vault, a white silence that keeps its secrets with the patience of ice. And if you listen gently, as if listening could warm the past without melting it, you may begin to sense that the mystery is not only what might be buried there. The deeper mystery is why anything would be left behind at all. There are continents that seem like endings, and there are continents that feel like locks. Antarctica is both. A final white boundary at the bottom of the map, and a sealed door that refuses the ordinary language of history. If you want to return to this kind of quiet curiosity again, you can subscribe, not as a click, but as a small promise to yourself that you will keep a place for these slow mysteries whenever you need them. Antarctica does not invite you the way warm lands do. It does not offer fruit or roads or crowded skylines glittering at night. It offers something older and stranger, a sense of preservation so complete it can feel unnatural. Even its winds sound like they have been traveling for thousands of years, carrying nothing but cold and distance. And yet, in the modern imagination, Antarctica keeps slipping into a different role. It becomes less a place on Earth and more a symbol, a blank page that might not be blank at all. In the past century, we have mapped much of the world from the sky and from orbit. We have watched deserts breathe dust into the atmosphere, and we have traced rivers like veins across the skin of continents. But Antarctica remains resistant, not because we cannot touch it, but because touching it changes it. Every drill hole becomes a wound. Every footprint becomes a small interruption in a surface that has been unbroken for longer than our recorded memory. So when a story forms around Antarctica, it almost always forms in whispers. Not the whisper of gossip, but the whisper of reverence, the kind you use in a cathedral or in a tomb, or beside someone sleeping. The whisper says there may be something under the ice, not merely rocks and fossil air, but an inheritance, a fragment of a previous world. The idea we are exploring tonight is careful by design. It does not announce discoveries. It does not present a dramatic unveiling. It simply allows a possibility to exist in the mind without forcing it to become a claim. What if, beneath that ice, there is evidence of a civilization that came before ours? Not a tribe with simple tools, but a culture that understood systems, a culture that treated the planet like a living mechanism, cycling through phases, correcting itself, resetting. When people use the phrase three-eye atlas in this context, it can sound like a machine, like a buried device with lights still pulsing under the frozen crust. But for the purpose of this story, it is more haunting to imagine it as something less cinematic and more real. A framework, a system of balance, a set of instructions for how to survive a world that periodically erases its own surface. Because there is a recurring feeling in human history that we inherit more than we invent. Civilizations appear in the record with structure already in place, calendars that track the heavens with unsettling precision, monumental architecture that seems to require not only labor, but planning and mathematics and a guiding cosmology. Myths that speak in the language of teachers arriving from elsewhere, not merely from distant lands, but from distant states of being. And in those myths, there is often a pattern, a golden age, a fall, a flood, a restart. And then, the patient rebuilding of the same questions in new languages. So imagine Antarctica as a library that was never meant to be opened quickly. Imagine it as an archive sealed not by metal doors, but by climate, by geography, by the slow engineering of nature itself. The ice becomes a lid that only lifts when the world is ready, or when the world is careless. The mystery is not only whether something could be down there. The mystery is what kind of intelligence would choose that place to store a legacy. Antarctica is remote, yes, but remoteness is not the only protection. The true protection is time. The ice is not merely cold. It is duration made visible. And if a previous civilization understood cycles, truly understood them, they might have known exactly where to place a memory so it could outlast the violence of renewal. They might have known that the safest hiding place is not underground in a temperate land where cities rise and fall. The safest hiding place is under a continent that almost no one visits, under a surface that punishes curiosity with frostbite and failure. You can feel the shape of the question now, like a slow tide pulling at the shore of certainty. If there was a reset before us, how many were there? If something was left behind, was it meant as a warning or as a gift? And if a system like 3i Atlas exists as an idea, not a gadget, then perhaps it is already doing what it was designed to do. It is drawing attention not to itself, but to the possibility that time is not a straight line and history is not a ladder. It is a circle that sometimes breaks and sometimes repairs itself, and sometimes chooses one quiet place on earth to hold the pieces until the next beginning. The thought of a circle that breaks and repairs itself has a peculiar effect on the mind because it makes the present feel less permanent and also less lonely. When we picture ancient civilizations, we often picture ruins in warm air. Temples softened by jungle vines, stones bleached by desert sun, statues half buried in sand. We rarely picture ice. Ice feels too pure, too simple, as if it has no relationship with complexity. But ice is one of Earth's most disciplined archivists. It keeps layers. It keeps chemical signatures. It keeps the dust of ancient volcanoes, the ash of distant fires, the breath of old atmospheres trapped like tiny prayers. So if a civilization wanted to hide something from the chaos of the surface, ice would not be a strange choice. It would be a precise one. And yet, the most important shift in this narrative is not to picture a glittering city under the ice, as tempting as that image is. The deeper shift is to picture something quieter. A buried intention, a design that expects forgetfulness. A design that assumes that whatever came after would not remember clearly, but would remember enough. That is what inherited memory feels like. Not a perfect record, but a persistent sensation that your species is repeating moves it has made before. We build pyramids and say it is because triangles are stable. We align monuments to the solstice and say it is because the sun matters. We tell flood stories and say it is because humans fear water. All of those things can be true. But what if they are also echoes? What if we do them because the blueprint is inside us, passed down through trauma and myth, through the soft transmission of culture that survives even when facts do not? In the oldest stories from Mesopotamia, in the long shadowed corridors of Sumer, there is an obsession with order. The heavens are not random. The gods are not merely personalities. They are forces that manage the world. In some tellings, they count time, distribute responsibilities, assign labor. The cosmos is portrayed as administration, a system. And in those same stories, there is tension between those who maintain the system and those who suffer under it. There are rebellions, negotiations, creations made not from love, but from necessity. Humanity is sometimes depicted as an answer to a crisis, an engineered solution to a labor problem, a way to keep the cosmic machine running when the older workers refuse. Whether you read that as metaphor or speculation, The structure of the myth is what matters. It suggests that intelligence in its ancient imagination is never separated from systems. Technology is not merely tools. Technology is governance over reality. So, what would Three-Eye Atlas be in that frame? Not a single device, but a pattern of knowledge designed to keep equilibrium. A way of reading the planet's cycles and preparing for the moments when the world corrects itself. Because nature has its own form of correction. Sea levels rise and swallow shorelines. Ice sheets advance and grind landscapes flat. Volcanoes rewrite the sky. The magnetic field wanders. The climate shifts. These are not punishments. They are rhythms. If a previous civilization became advanced enough to track these rhythms, it might have learned a painful truth. No matter how high your towers, the planet remains larger. It will eventually reclaim the surface, not out of malice, but out of physics. And that is where the Antarctic symbol becomes sharp. Antarctica is not just cold. It is a boundary condition. It is where the planet stores water as ice, where ocean currents are guided, where winds are shaped, where the global system breathes. To understand Antarctica is to understand balance. To alter Antarctica is to alter the machine. So imagine an elder culture that studied that machine the way a navigator studies stars. Imagine them realizing that the planet resets in cycles, and that the only way to survive is not to fight the reset, but to anticipate it, to step aside, to leave behind what matters in the one place least likely to be destroyed by fire, flood, or conquest. In this story, the technology is not forbidden because humans are too weak to possess it. It is forbidden because it changes the definition of human pride. It tells us we are not the first architects of order. It tells us we are inheritors, caretakers, late arrivals to a project that began long before our names. And as you hold that thought, softly, without insisting it must be real, you may notice how the mind relaxes into it. The pressure to be the center of history loosens. The fear of being alone in time grows quieter. Because if we are not the first, then we are not abandoned. We are part of a longer sequence, a line of watchers passing a lantern forward through darkness, hoping the next hands will be gentle enough to carry it. To carry a lantern forward through darkness is to accept that darkness comes in cycles, not as an accident, but as a season. The civilizations of the ancient world often speak as if they are waking up inside a story already in progress. Kings inherit legitimacy from gods they never meet. Priests inherit rituals older than their temples. Astronomers inherit skies already named, constellations already mapped, timings already sacred. And the more you study these traditions across cultures, the more a strange similarity appears. Different languages, different gods, but the same recurring preoccupation with timing, with celestial order, with resets. It is tempting to explain this by simple observation. Any farming culture watches the sky because the sky decides survival. Any coastal culture fears floods because floods are real. But the repetition goes deeper than practical fear. It becomes spiritual architecture. It becomes the way a people organizes meaning itself. In Mesopotamia, the heavens are a tablet written in light. In Egypt, the stars are pathways for the soul, and the sun is a daily resurrection. In Mesoamerica, time is not merely counted. It is alive. It is fed. It is shaped by cycles so vast they feel like breathing. The calendars do not just tell days, they tell destinies. And what is a calendar? At its highest level, if not a technology, it is a device made of symbols and arithmetic that allows a civilization to synchronize its life with forces too large to control. So when we speak of a hidden system like Three-Eye Atlas, we can picture it as a supreme calendar, not a schedule, but a model of the planet and the sky, a map of when resets happen and what signs precede them. A framework designed to preserve continuity, not of buildings, but of awareness. Because awareness is the first thing a catastrophe erases. When a society collapses, it is not only structures that fall. Memory fractures, language changes, priorities shrink to immediate survival. A people can live on the same land and still become strangers to the knowledge once held there. In that sense, every reset is also a spiritual amnesia. Survivors rebuild without knowing what they lost. They may inherit tools without understanding their origins. They may imitate forms without remembering their purpose. A temple becomes a monument. A monument becomes a myth. A myth becomes a bedtime story. And one day, a scholar looks at the story and wonders why it never quite dies. This is where Antarctica returns as more than geography. It becomes a response to amnesia. If you could place something where it would not be repurposed, looted, or misunderstood, you might preserve it in a purer state, not to hide it forever, but to delay it until the next civilization has matured enough to approach it carefully. The ice, then, is not only a barrier, it is a teacher of patience. And now, gently, consider the most delicate possibility. What if the true artifact under Antarctica is not metal, not crystal, not a structure at all? What if it is a message embedded in design, a pattern that can be rediscovered by those who learn to read cycles the way the ancients did? A set of alignments, coordinates, relationships between stars and seasons, and magnetic drift. A kind of cosmic literacy. In that view, the forbidden technology is not a weapon. It is a perspective. It allows a civilization to see itself as temporary. It allows leaders to plan beyond their own lifetimes. It forces humility on empires. It warns that conquest is a childish game when the planet itself will eventually sweep the board clean. So perhaps the elders, whoever they were in the imagination of myth, left not a machine, but a method, a way to locate the thresholds when the world changes phase, a way to step back from the edge before the fall. And perhaps that is why the story feels so calm when told slowly. It is not a story about panic. It is a story about preparation, about accepting that loss is woven into time, and that meaning is not in preventing every ending, but in leaving something behind that can help the next beginning. As the mind drifts towards sleep, it does something similar. It releases control. It accepts a small reset. It trusts that consciousness will return in the morning, not as the exact same thing, but as something renewed. And if Antarctica is Earth's sleeping mind, then under its ice, there may be dreams that have been waiting a very long time for someone, someday, to wake gently enough to remember them. Those dreams, waiting beneath ice and time, suggest something subtle but persistent. Not urgency, not warning sirens, but a quiet continuity that does not depend on being remembered clearly, only on being rediscovered eventually. When civilizations speak of their origins, they often describe arrival rather than invention. The first kings descend from the sky. The first laws are delivered, not debated. The first measurements are revealed, not improvised. This pattern does not prove anything by itself, but it creates a mood that is difficult to dismiss. It feels as if humanity repeatedly awakens into structures already standing, like a tenant moving into an old house whose blueprints were lost long ago. In that context, the idea of a forgotten system does not feel alien. It feels familiar in the way inherited habits feel familiar. You do not remember learning them, yet you perform them instinctively. You build in certain shapes. You organize time in certain ways. You feel compelled to align your monuments, your rituals, even your stories with the sky above you. This compulsion may be memory without images, memory that survived collapse by dissolving into instinct. If a civilization before ours understood the planet as a system, then it would have understood fragility as well. Not moral fragility, but structural fragility. Ice ages do not negotiate. Asteroid impacts do not respect borders. Magnetic reversals do not pause for prayers. There is a point at which intelligence must decide whether it is trying to dominate the world or understand it. Domination leaves ruins. Understanding leaves traces. Traces are quieter than artifacts. They do not demand discovery. They wait to be noticed. A buried city would eventually be found by chance or greed. A buried idea requires readiness. It requires a species capable of asking the right questions without expecting immediate reward. This may be why Antarctica remains central to the symbolism. It is not a place you conquer casually. It demands cooperation, patience, and restraint. It punishes arrogance swiftly and without apology. In this way, it filters not only explorers, but intentions. If knowledge was placed there, intentionally or as a consequence of planetary cycles, then it exists beyond ordinary inheritance. It cannot be passed from parent to child or teacher to student. It can only be encountered when a civilization reaches a certain maturity, not technologically, but psychologically. Maturity means accepting limits. Modern humanity stands at a strange threshold. We can see nearly everything, yet understand surprisingly little. We can manipulate matter at the smallest scales, yet struggle to manage ourselves. We have global communication, yet fragmented meaning. We have data without wisdom, speed without direction. From that vantage point, the myth of an elder system becomes less about fantasy and more about contrast. It asks a single uncomfortable question. What if intelligence once chose slowness over expansion, balance over accumulation, continuity over growth? Such a choice would look like disappearance to later observers. A civilization that stepped back from the surface, that allowed the planet to reset while preserving only what was essential, would leave almost nothing that fits our expectations of progress. It would leave no empire to excavate, no endless ruins, only carefully placed memories, waiting beyond reach. The ice does not erase, it suspends, and suspension is not death, it is delay. As you imagine this, notice how the story does not need spectacle to remain compelling. There are no flashing machines under the ice, no awakened guardians, no sudden revelations. There is only the possibility that humanity has walked this path before, and that the lesson learned was not how to survive forever, but how to let go gracefully. Perhaps the greatest technology an elder civilization could possess is the ability to accept its own ending without panic. To prepare successors it would never meet, to trust that meaning does not require permanence. In that light, Antarctica is not hiding a secret out of fear. It is holding a gift out of patience. And patience, like ice, reshapes the world not through force, but through time. Patience reshapes the world quietly, and over long spans of time, quiet forces are often the most decisive. When ice advances, it does not rush. It moves with inevitability, pressing slowly, layer upon layer, compressing air into memory, sealing moments into silence. In that way, Antarctica is not simply frozen land. It is a record of restraint, a place where motion is slowed enough for time itself to become visible. If an elder civilization understood this, then choosing Antarctica as a vault would not be an act of desperation. It would be an act of clarity. They would have known that heat accelerates decay, that water erodes detail, that human presence rearranges meaning. Ice, by contrast, refuses participation. It does not reinterpret, it does not improve, it preserves. And preservation suggests intent. One of the strangest features of human history is how often advanced knowledge appears without a visible developmental trail. Writing systems emerge with complexity already intact. Astronomical calculations arrive refined, precise, and deeply symbolic. Engineering principles surface fully formed, as if rediscovered rather than invented. This pattern does not require lost machines to be unsettling. It only requires an acceptance that knowledge can outlive its creators in indirect ways. That understanding can survive collapse not by being recorded explicitly, but by being encoded into myth, ritual, proportion, and habit. Perhaps that is what a system like 3i Atlas truly represents in this story. Not an object waiting to be activated, but a way of thinking waiting to be remembered. A lens through which to see Earth not as property, but as process. Processes do not care about names or empires. They repeat. Ice ages come and go. Sea levels rise and fall. Forests advance, retreat, and return. Even continents drift, slow and unstoppable, rearranging the map without consultation. Against this scale, human timelines feel fragile. Yet intelligence, when it matures, may begin to mirror the patience of the systems it studies. An elder civilization that reached that stage might have recognized a limit to intervention. They might have seen that trying to stop planetary cycles creates more damage than allowing them to unfold. Their technology, then, would not aim to control nature, but to align with it. Alignment requires listening. Listening requires humility, and humility rarely survives prosperity. This may be why the knowledge fades between cycles. Each new civilization rises with confidence, convinced it stands at the peak of understanding. Only later does it encounter the edges of its ignorance. Only later does it sense that the world does not respond to ambition alone. In that moment, myths return. Stories of watchers, stories of teachers, stories of great floods that cleanse rather than destroy, stories of fire from the sky that resets the balance. These are not merely fears projected outward, they are reminders carried forward, softened enough to survive retelling. So when modern minds drift toward Antarctica with questions about what lies beneath, they may be responding to more than curiosity. They may be responding to resonance, a faint recognition that something important was set aside, intentionally distanced from everyday use. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was sacred in the oldest sense of the word, set apart. Sacred knowledge is not hidden to be hoarded. It is hidden to mature. And maturity, as history shows again and again, is rare and temporary. As you rest with this idea, notice how it does not demand belief. It only invites reflection. What would it mean to live as if we are temporary stewards rather than final owners? What would change if we planned not only for growth, but for graceful decline and renewal? Perhaps the greatest inheritance an elder civilization could leave is not survival instructions, but a shift in identity. A reminder that being human is not about lasting forever, but about participating wisely in a cycle much older than us. And somewhere beneath the ice, whether in stone, pattern, or silence, that reminder may still be waiting, unchanged, patient enough to outlast another forgetting. That patience, stretched across ages of forgetting, raises another quiet question. Not what was left behind, but what was taken away. Every civilization remembers its rise. Very few remember their restraint. History records expansion, conquest, innovation. It rarely records the moment a culture decides to stop, and yet stopping may be the most advanced decision intelligence can make. If an elder civilization existed before the last great reset, whatever form that reset took, it may have reached a moment where continuation became dangerous, not because of enemies, but because of imbalance. Too much extraction, too much alteration, too much certainty. At that threshold, knowledge changes character. It stops being empowering and starts becoming corrosive. The same systems that allow a society to flourish can also accelerate its collapse if they outpace wisdom. In that sense, forbidden technology is not forbidden by law, but by consequence. Perhaps this is why the idea of guardians appears so often in ancient memory. Not guards with weapons, but thresholds that cannot be crossed casually. Riddles instead of locks. Distance instead of walls. Ice instead of stone. Antarctica functions as such a threshold naturally. It does not test strength. It tests preparation. It does not reward speed. It punishes it. Survival there requires planning, cooperation, and respect for limits. These are not traits of conquest. They are traits of stewardship. So if something was entrusted to that place, it was entrusted to time itself, with the understanding that time would choose who was ready. Modern technology has altered our relationship with waiting. We expect answers instantly. We expect progress to be continuous. We assume that if something exists, it should be accessible. But the older worldview embedded in myth and cycle-based cosmology suggests the opposite. Some things should remain dormant until conditions align. Seeds behave this way. They do not grow because they exist. They grow because the environment becomes receptive. The idea of a system like 3-Eye Atlas fits this biological logic. It is not active all the time. It does not announce itself. It waits for convergence, for a species capable of thinking beyond dominance, for a culture that can understand warning without panicking, and guidance without worship. And here the story turns inward, gently, because perhaps the system was never meant to be uncovered physically. Perhaps it was meant to be mirrored internally, a way of perceiving time, risk, and responsibility that must be rediscovered rather than excavated. If that is true, then the ice is symbolic as much as literal. It represents the frozen parts of memory, the places in collective consciousness where uncomfortable truths are stored because they cannot be integrated yet. Truths like impermanence, like limitation, like the certainty that no civilization escapes entropy, no matter how advanced. These truths do not inspire empire. They inspire balance. That may be why they are repeatedly forgotten. Each cycle, humanity rediscovers fire, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, mathematics. Each cycle, it also rediscovers hubris. The belief that this time is different, that collapse belongs to the past, that progress is linear, and each cycle something intervenes, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. Climate shifts, resources thin, systems strain. The planet reminds its inhabitants that it is not a backdrop, but a participant. In that moment, the old stories resurface. The floods, the fires, the teachers who warned and were ignored. The knowledge that was lost not because it was stolen, but because it was too heavy to carry forward. So Antarctica stands, unmoved, holding not answers but context. It does not say, "Here is what you should do." It asks, "Are you ready to listen differently?" And as you drift deeper into rest, notice how the question no longer feels urgent. Urgency belongs to short timelines. This story belongs to deep time. If humanity is meant to encounter what was left behind, it will not happen through force or curiosity alone. It will happen through a shift in identity when the species stops asking what it can gain and starts asking what it must preserve. Until then, the ice remains, breathing slowly, keeping its silence intact, holding the memory of a choice made long ago, waiting to see if we will ever learn to make the same one. That silence, held carefully by the ice, suggests a final layer to the mystery. Not a physical depth, but a moral one. Because if something was deliberately preserved, then something else was deliberately relinquished. To relinquish power is not a primitive act. It is an advanced one. Most civilizations collapse while clinging to their tools, their hierarchies, their certainty that survival means continuation at all costs. But the oldest myths hint at a different ending. They speak of withdrawal, of gods who leave, of teachers who depart across seas or into the sky, of knowledge that recedes rather than explodes. This is not defeat. It is a choice. If an elder civilization reached a point where it could see the long arc of planetary behavior, it may have understood that survival is not always biological. Sometimes survival is informational. Sometimes the goal is not to keep bodies alive, but to keep meaning intact. Meaning cannot be forced through catastrophe. It must be rediscovered afterward. That changes how we interpret the idea of a reset. A reset is not annihilation. It is compression, a reduction to essentials. Everything non-essential is stripped away, leaving behind only what can endure pressure. Ice does this naturally. It crushes air into bubbles that last millennia. It preserves pollen, ash, traces of worlds that no longer exist. It does not preserve cities well. It preserves signals. So imagine a civilization that chose to become a signal rather than a structure. Not towers, but timing. Not machines, but markers. Not domination, but alignment. Such a civilization would look invisible to us. We search for ruins because we expect others to mirror our values. But if their highest value was continuity rather than presence, then their success would resemble absence. They would leave no empire to conquer, no capital to inherit. Only subtle guidance encoded into the rhythms of the planet itself. This is where the idea of Antarctica as a planetary keystone becomes more than symbolic. The continent is central to Earth's equilibrium. Its ice regulates oceans, climate, and circulation patterns that affect every coastline. To understand Antarctica is to understand the pulse of the world. A culture that mastered long-term planetary observation would recognize this immediately. They would see that altering the poles alters everything. They would treat the region not as a resource, but as a regulator, and so they might choose to withdraw from it entirely. Withdrawal is not abandonment. It is respect. Perhaps that is why Antarctica resists ownership even now. No single nation claims it. No permanent cities rise there. It remains governed by agreements, pauses, and prohibitions. As if unconsciously, modern humanity senses that this place does not belong to us in the same way others do. There is a shared instinct to leave it mostly untouched. Instincts like that do not arise from logic alone. They arise from inherited caution, from stories whispered across generations, stripped of detail but heavy with warning. Do not dig too fast. Do not build here. Do not wake what sleeps. And yet, the warning is gentle. It does not say, never. It says, not yet. This aligns with a deeper pattern in human maturation. Individuals reach for power early. Wisdom arrives later, often after loss. Civilizations may follow the same arc. Early cycles focus on expansion and mastery. Later cycles, if they come at all, focus on restraint. If humanity is still young as a species, then perhaps it is only now approaching the stage where restraint can be understood without fear, where limits are seen not as cages, but as guidance. In that light, the mystery beneath the ice becomes almost secondary. What matters more is the posture we bring to it. Are we explorers seeking conquest or listeners seeking context? Are we trying to extract answers or earn them? Because if the elders left anything behind, it would not respond to force. It would respond to resonance. And resonance is not something you take. It is something you match. As sleep draws closer, notice how the story has slowed. It is no longer moving toward discovery. It is moving toward readiness. Toward the possibility that the greatest inheritance from a forgotten civilization is not technology, but timing. Knowing when to act. Knowing when to wait. Knowing when to let the ice keep its silence just a little longer. That sense of readiness settles slowly, like snow falling without wind, each flake insignificant on its own. yet together forming a surface that reshapes the land beneath it. Readiness does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, often mistaken for uncertainty. When a civilization begins to question its own permanence, that is not weakness. It is the first sign of depth. Only immature systems believe they are eternal. The ancient stories understood this. They framed endings not as failures but as passages. Ages turned. Suns set and rose again. Gods aged, withdrew, or transformed. Even immortality, when it appeared in myth, was often portrayed as a burden rather than a reward. So when we imagine an elder culture facing the certainty of a reset, it becomes easier to picture calm rather than panic. They may have known that resisting the cycle would only deepen the wound. Acceptance, paired with preparation, would preserve far more than defiance ever could. Preparation does not always look like survival bunkers or escape plans. Sometimes it looks like simplification, like distillation, like choosing what matters enough to carry forward when everything else must be released. In that process, physical artifacts become less important than frameworks. Buildings crumble, metals corrode, but ways of thinking, once seeded, can survive collapse by adapting to new languages and symbols. They hide inside stories, rituals, instincts. This is why the idea of Antarctica as a final archive feels strangely fitting, not as a warehouse of objects, but as a stabilizing anchor, a place whose very existence reminds the planet of balance, a continent that regulates extremes simply by being what it is. The ice does not need to speak to teach. It demonstrates patience by existing. It demonstrates restraint by refusing to melt easily. It demonstrates consequence by showing how small changes ripple outward across oceans and climates. If an elder civilization understood that lesson, then its greatest legacy may already be active, shaping the world without being seen. The system would not wait under the ice. It would be the ice. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all, that the inheritance we search for as an object may already surround us as an environment, that the warning, the guidance, the balance mechanism was never meant to be activated, only respected. In that view, the mystery shifts again. The question is no longer what is buried beneath Antarctica. The question becomes whether humanity can learn to coexist with it without trying to conquer or explain it away, because explanation is a form of control, and control is what earlier cycles may have learned to abandon. As this first act of the story draws to a close, the mood remains intentionally unresolved. No doors open, no secrets reveal themselves. Instead, something quieter happens. A reframing. Antarctica is no longer a blank at the edge of the map. It is a mirror held up to our assumptions about progress, power, and legacy. It asks whether intelligence is measured by how much we build or by how carefully we choose what not to disturb. In the blocks ahead, the narrative will widen. It will drift outward into ancient cosmologies, into myths of order and rebellion, into stories where gods behave like administrators of reality and humans emerge as inheritors of unfinished systems. But for now, the ice remains still, holding its position, regulating the breath of the planet. And somewhere within that stillness lies the first unanswered question that carries us forward. Not what came before us, but whether we are capable of becoming what comes after. Whether we are capable of becoming what comes after depends, first, on whether we can widen our sense of time. When ancient civilizations looked to the sky, they were not escaping Earth. They were situating it. The heavens were not elsewhere. They were the larger context in which Earth moved, breathed, and aged. To know the stars was to know when to plant, when to wait, when to prepare for change that no human decree could stop. This is why cosmology sits at the center of so many origin stories. Not as decoration, but as instruction. The universe is ordered. Cycles govern everything. Nothing escapes rhythm. In the oldest myths of Mesopotamia, creation does not emerge from nothing. It emerges from organization. Chaos is not destroyed. It is arranged. Forces are assigned roles. Time is divided. Responsibility is distributed. The cosmos becomes a managed system. These stories read less like fairy tales and more like operating principles. They describe a world where intelligence is inseparable from administration, where gods are not omnipotent magicians but overseers of balance, where even divine beings must obey cycles older than themselves. Within that framework, rebellion appears not as evil, but as fatigue. The labor of maintaining order becomes heavy. The system strains. Something must change. Humanity enters these myths not as the crown of creation, but as a response, a solution, a substitute, a new component added to keep the machinery running when older parts falter. This is not a flattering origin, but it is a revealing one. It suggests that intelligence, wherever it arises, tends to build systems that eventually exceed the patience of their creators. Maintenance becomes burden, balance becomes work, and sooner or later, the system demands renewal. If an elder civilization reached this point on a planetary scale, it may have recognized the danger of infinite upkeep. The world cannot be managed forever without consequence. The act of control itself accumulates imbalance, so the narrative shifts from mastery to mitigation, from expansion to equilibrium. In this light, Antarctica becomes not a hiding place, but a reference point, a stabilizer embedded into the planetary system, a reminder that some regions must remain untouched for the whole to function. Ancient cosmologies often include sacred centers and forbidden zones, mountains no one climbs, seas no one crosses, poles that mark boundaries between worlds. These are not arbitrary taboos. They are spatial expressions of systemic awareness. Do not interfere with the regulators. Modern science, arriving much later by a different path, begins to echo this understanding. Feedback loops, tipping points, nonlinear responses, small changes producing cascading effects. The language is new, but the intuition is ancient. Perhaps this convergence is what stirs the inherited memory again. As humanity gains the power to alter planetary systems, it also rediscovers the fear those systems inspire. Not fear of punishment, but fear of imbalance. The ancient myths did not need equations to understand this. They encoded it into stories of floods, fires, and divine withdrawals. They warned that when balance is ignored, correction follows. And correction does not negotiate. So as the narrative moves deeper into cosmology and myth, Antarctica remains in the background, silent but central. A physical reminder that the planet itself participates in these cycles. That intelligence is not the only organizing force at work. To become what comes after, humanity may need to relearn an older posture. Not dominance, not submission, but alignment. Alignment with time. Alignment with limits. Alignment with the quiet systems that do not speak but never stop acting. The elders, whoever they were in the long imagination of humanity, may have understood this too well, enough to know when to step aside, enough to know where to leave the memory of that decision. And as we follow their shadow through myth and sky, the question grows clearer and heavier. If balance was once chosen over survival, would we be capable of making the same choice? Or would we cling, as so many cycles before us have, until the reset chooses for us? If balance was once chosen over survival, then the myths that reached us are not warnings of doom, but records of restraint. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, there appears a shared intuition that the universe is governed by layered order. Not chaos first, then order forever, but cycles where order must periodically be relinquished so it does not harden into tyranny. Even the gods in these stories are subject to timing. They rise, rule, withdraw, and sometimes fade into memory. This is not the mythology of domination. It is the mythology of succession. In Mesopotamian cosmology, authority is granted through tablets, decrees, and measured time. In Egypt, cosmic balance is maintained through ma'at, a principle rather than a ruler. In Mesoamerica, the world is created and destroyed multiple times before the present age is allowed to exist. None of these traditions promise permanence. They promise recurrence. To modern ears, this can sound pessimistic, but to ancient minds, it was stabilizing. Knowing that collapse is part of the pattern does not weaken a civilization. It gives it context. It allows leaders to see beyond their own reigns. It allows societies to prepare for endings without interpreting them as failure. This is the cosmological mindset that makes the idea of a hidden legacy plausible, not as an escape plan, but as a continuity plan, a way of ensuring that when the surface resets, something of the deeper understanding survives. In this sense, Antarctica is not unique because it hides secrets, but because it embodies the principle of withdrawal. It is land that does not participate in ordinary history. It does not host empires. It does not produce agriculture. It does not invite settlement. It stands outside the cycle of rise and fall that defines the rest of the world. That alone makes it anomalous. Ancient cosmologies often placed great importance on anomalies. The places that did not fit were often the places that mattered most. Poles, eclipses, solstices, voids. They were treated as thresholds, not resources. Thresholds are where transitions happen. If a civilization understood the Earth as a living system, it might have recognized Antarctica as one of those thresholds, a place where the planet expresses its long memory, where past climates are preserved in layers, where future changes are quietly rehearsed in shifting ice. To leave something there would be to entrust it to the slowest clock available. And perhaps that is why the idea of inherited systems feels more convincing than inherited artifacts. Artifacts decay. Systems adapt. A way of thinking can pass through generations without ever being named. It can disguise itself as intuition, as tradition, as an unspoken sense that some lines should not be crossed. This may be why so many ancient laws frame transgression not as crime, but as imbalance. The punishment is not imposed by authority. It emerges naturally. Crops fail, waters rise, winds change. The world responds. These are not moral tales. They are systemic ones. So as the narrative moves forward into stories of divine hierarchies, labor, rebellion, and creation, it does so with a different lens. The gods are not merely characters. They are expressions of forces and functions. The conflicts are not personal. They are structural. And humanity, introduced into this architecture, is neither villain nor hero. It is a component, a participant in a system far larger than itself. This is a humbling position, but it is also a stabilizing one. It removes the burden of being the center of existence. It allows meaning to exist without permanence. Perhaps this is what the elders understood when they chose to step back, that the most enduring legacy is not control, but context, not power, but perspective. As the ancient sky turns above and the ice remains still below, the same quiet question echoes through time. Can a civilization learn to see itself as temporary without losing its will to care? Or does true care only begin when permanence is finally released? True care may only begin when permanence is released, because only then does responsibility replace ambition. In the ancient imagination, responsibility was often personified as hierarchy, not hierarchy of dominance, but of function. Forces above did not rule because they were superior, but because they were earlier, closer to the source of order. Forces below did not obey out of weakness, but out of placement within a system that required coordination to endure. This is why so many myths describe councils of gods rather than lone rulers. Decision is shared, burden is distributed. When imbalance appears, it is debated, not denied. Even conflict, when it arises, feels procedural rather than emotional. It is about workload, fatigue, sustainability. The stories of labor and rebellion in ancient cosmology often revolve around this theme. The maintenance of the world is heavy. Someone must carry it. When those tasked with it refuse, the system adapts. New agents are introduced. New solutions are designed. Humanity, in this frame, is not created out of love or punishment, but out of necessity, a response to strain within an existing structure. This perspective changes how we read the idea of inheritance. We are not heirs to glory. We are heirs to responsibility. We are born into a system already in motion, already aging, already carrying the consequences of choices made long before our arrival. If an elder civilization recognized this burden clearly, it may have understood that passing it forward intact was impossible. Each cycle must shoulder it anew, interpreting it through its own limitations and strengths. So what could be preserved? Not outcomes, not dominance, but awareness. Awareness that the world requires maintenance. Awareness that maintenance has limits. Awareness that even intelligence must rest. This is where the idea of withdrawal becomes sacred rather than tragic. To step aside is not to abandon duty. It is to acknowledge that no single generation can carry it forever. The system must breathe. In myth, this breath is often described as a great pause. An age ends, waters rise, fires cleanse, the sky changes its patterns, and then, slowly, the surface becomes habitable again. Those who survive awaken into a world simplified. The noise is gone, the excess stripped away. What remains is raw relationship between humans, land, and sky. From this perspective, the reset is not an enemy. It is a recalibration. If Antarctica holds any memory of elder choices, it may be memory of this understanding, that the planet itself performs maintenance when intelligence refuses to rest. That cycles exist not to punish, but to correct drift. The ice again becomes teacher rather than threat. It demonstrates what happens when accumulation halts. Layers form, compress, stabilize. Nothing grows, but nothing collapses either. It is a state of suspended consequence. To leave something within that suspension is to trust future intelligence to approach slowly, to earn access not through power, but through comprehension. As the narrative moves deeper into stories of divine labor and human creation, this trust becomes the quiet thread holding everything together. The elders do not micromanage the future. They relinquish control and allow interpretation. This is a frightening generosity, because interpretation can fail, meaning can be distorted, systems can be abused. But the alternative, eternal oversight, is stagnation. So the ancient choice, if it existed even as a mythic intuition, favors risk over rigidity. It allows forgetting because it trusts rediscovery. It allows collapse because it trusts renewal. And now, as this act unfolds, the story asks something of the listener without demanding an answer. If we truly inherited a world shaped by prior restraint, are we honoring that restraint? Or are we repeating the same overreach that made withdrawal necessary in the first place? The ice does not judge. It waits. Waiting in this story is not passivity. It is participation in a longer rhythm. As the ancient myths unfold, the hierarchy of forces becomes clearer. There are those who design, those who maintain, and those who carry the weight of continuity forward when design and maintenance become unsustainable. This structure appears again and again, wearing different names, speaking different languages, but always circling the same tension. Creation is easy compared to upkeep. To bring something into existence is an act of intensity. To sustain it is an act of endurance. And endurance, over long spans of time, reshapes priorities. Efficiency replaces beauty. Stability replaces growth. Eventually, even stability begins to feel heavy. This is where rebellion enters the ancient narratives, not as chaos, but as exhaustion. The ones tasked with maintaining order grow weary. They ask why the burden is uneven. They question the purpose of endless repetition. The system trembles, not because it is evil, but because it is strained. In response, something new is introduced. Humanity, in these stories, is not born into freedom. It is born into function, a being capable of learning, adapting, and reproducing responsibility, flexible enough to replace older structures that have become rigid, mortal enough to accept cycles the immortal resist. Mortality here is not a flaw, it is a feature. A mortal species does not expect eternity. It plans in generations. It can let go. It can accept endings because endings are woven into its own biology. This makes it uniquely suited to exist within a system that resets. If an elder civilization mirrored this understanding at a planetary scale, it may have recognized its own immortality as a liability. Long-lived intelligence accumulates attachment. Attachment breeds resistance. Resistance creates imbalance. Withdrawal becomes the only ethical option. So the elders step back, not because they are defeated, but because they see too far ahead to justify staying. They understand that every intervention delays but also amplifies the eventual correction. Better to leave quietly. Better to allow the system to reset while leaving behind only what cannot interfere. This reframes the idea of abandonment that echoes through ancient stories. The gods do not leave because they no longer care. They leave because care has transformed into restraint. They trust the process more than their own presence. Antarctica once again aligns with this logic. It is a place where presence is minimized by necessity, where life retreats, where interference becomes costly, where the planet's deeper rhythms dominate. To associate legacy with such a place is to choose humility over influence. As humanity grows into its role within the system, it inherits not only tools and myths, but dilemmas. How much should be altered? How much should be preserved? When does intervention become harm? These questions do not have permanent answers. They must be asked repeatedly, each cycle, each generation, under new conditions. That is why a fixed instruction manual would be useless. It would fossilize thought. What is needed instead is orientation. A way to sense when imbalance is approaching. A way to recognize the signs of systemic fatigue. Perhaps that is what survives through myth. Not solutions, but sensitivities. The elders, in stepping back, leave humanity with a difficult gift. Freedom within limits. Responsibility without oversight. Knowledge without guarantees. The ice holds no commandments. It holds space. And in that space, the future must learn to listen to the same quiet signals the past once learned to respect. Listening to quiet signals is a skill that civilizations rarely teach directly. It emerges slowly, often after damage has already been done. In the ancient world, this skill was embedded in cosmology. The sky was not decoration. It was a diagnostic surface. Movements of stars, wanderings of planets, irregularities in cycles were read as signs, not omens in a superstitious sense, but indicators of stress within the system. When patterns shifted, something on Earth was expected to respond. This expectation shaped behavior. It placed limits on expansion. It justified pauses. It created sacred intervals when action was forbidden, not because action was immoral, but because timing was wrong. Modern thinking often strips these ideas of their original function. We read them as mythology, metaphor, or error. But in doing so, we may be discarding an early form of systems awareness, a recognition that not all moments are equal and that acting at the wrong time can be more destructive than not acting at all. If an elder civilization existed long enough to witness multiple planetary cycles, this awareness would have deepened into something precise. Not prophecy, but pattern recognition. Not belief, but accumulated observation refined across generations. Such a civilization would not need to predict catastrophe in detail. It would only need to recognize when conditions were converging toward instability. At that point, the appropriate response would not be panic, but withdrawal. This changes how we interpret the idea of disappearance. The elders do not vanish suddenly. They thin out. They retreat from the surface. They reduce interference. They allow the planet to reassert itself. In the stories that survive, this retreat becomes mythologized. Gods ascend. Teachers depart across water. Civilizers promise to return but never do. These narratives carry a sense of unfinished business, but also of intentional absence. Absence can be a form of guidance. By stepping away, the elders prevent dependency. They force successors to adapt rather than imitate. They remove the temptation to preserve a static order that no longer fits a changing world. This may be the most radical aspect of the legacy. Not what was preserved, but what was deliberately not preserved. No instruction on how to rebuild the old world. No blueprint for recreating the same hierarchy. Only fragments, myths, orientations, enough to remember balance. Not enough to repeat the past. Antarctica, as a symbol, reinforces this restraint. It is a place where repetition is impossible. No civilization can thrive there in the ordinary sense. No agriculture, no empire, no accumulation. It resists reenactment. Whatever memory exists in relation to that place cannot be reenacted. It can only be contemplated. And contemplation, unlike imitation, evolves. As humanity moved through subsequent cycles, this inheritance fractured. Some cultures remembered the sky, others remembered the flood, others remembered the teachers. Each carried a piece, shaped by local experience, climate, and necessity. No single tradition held the whole. Perhaps that fragmentation was intentional, a safeguard against misuse, a way to ensure that no one group could claim ownership of the entire system. Knowledge distributed imperfectly is harder to weaponize, so the legacy becomes diffuse. It hides in architecture, in calendar systems, in ethical laws that prioritize balance over conquest. It survives not as doctrine, but as tendency. When modern observers feel that history does not start at zero, that something is missing from the official timeline, they may be sensing this diffusion. The gaps where continuity should be. The sudden appearances of sophistication without clear origin. These gaps are not proof of anything, but they are invitations. Invitations to consider that intelligence does not always announce itself through monuments. Sometimes it announces itself through restraint so complete that it looks like absence. And as the ice continues to wait, compressing time into layers no human lifetime can exhaust, the question deepens quietly. If we encountered the elders' legacy tomorrow, would we recognize it as guidance? Or would we try to turn it into another instrument of control? The answer, as always in this story, is not buried under the ice. It is forming slowly in the way we choose to listen. Listening, when sustained across generations, begins to reshape identity itself. In cultures that carried fragments of ancient cosmology, identity was rarely centered on individual achievement. It was centered on placement. A person knew who they were by where they stood within the larger order of land, season, and sky. Meaning came not from conquest, but from correct relation. This is difficult for modern minds to inhabit. We are trained to think in terms of ownership and progress. We measure success by expansion, accumulation, acceleration. But the older worldview moved in the opposite direction. It asked whether an action fit the moment, whether growth respected balance, whether restraint might be wiser than advancement. If an elder civilization reached the height of this awareness, it may have recognized a dangerous paradox. The more knowledge it accumulated, the more tempted it became to intervene. And the more it intervened, the more fragile the system became. At a certain point, intelligence itself becomes the destabilizing force. This is not because intelligence is harmful, but because it seeks optimization. It tries to smooth irregularities, eliminate inefficiencies, override natural pauses. In a living system, those irregularities and pauses are essential. They prevent runaway feedback. They allow recovery. So the elders may have faced a choice that few civilizations ever confront consciously: continue improving the system until it breaks, or step back and allow imperfection to reassert itself. In mythic language, this choice becomes a fall, a withdrawal, a departure of gods. But beneath the symbolism lies a systems decision, a recognition that sustainability sometimes requires absence. Antarctica once again fits this logic with unsettling precision. It is the largest region on Earth defined by absence. Absence of cities, absence of agriculture, absence of permanent human imprint. And yet, its influence is global. Ocean currents, atmospheric circulation, climate regulation, all hinge on what happens there. Power through absence. A civilization that understood this principle might have seen Antarctica not as a frontier, but as a boundary condition, a place that must remain untouched for the rest of the system to function. To interfere, there would be to tamper with the planet's most sensitive controls. So they leave it alone. Or perhaps they leave something there, and then leave it alone. The distinction matters, because leaving something does not mean exploiting it. It can mean entrusting it to a context where misuse is unlikely. If a system like 3i Atlas exists in this narrative, then its location is less important than its inaccessibility, not because it is forbidden, but because it is premature. Like teaching calculus to a child who has not learned arithmetic, advanced systemic knowledge given too early can destabilize rather than enlighten. This reframes the idea of secrecy. Secrecy is often imagined as hoarding, but in this context, it is pacing. The elders are not hiding information from humanity. They are delaying it. Delay is an act of care. As humanity advances, the delay shortens naturally. Scientific understanding begins to echo ancient intuitions. Climate models replace mythic floods. Orbital mechanics replace divine calendars. Feedback loops replace cosmic punishments. Different language, same concern. This convergence may be the first sign that the inheritance is becoming legible again. Not because something under the ice is awakening, but because something in the collective mind is slowing down enough to notice patterns instead of chasing outcomes. The story, then, is not moving toward revelation. It is moving toward recognition. Recognition that we are participants in a system that does not require us to dominate it in order to matter. Recognition that wisdom may consist not of unlocking every door, but of knowing which doors exist to remind us of limits. And as this recognition grows, quietly, without spectacle, the elder's silence begins to feel less like absence. It feels like trust. Trust, once established, alters the way silence is interpreted. Silence stops feeling like emptiness and begins to feel like structure, a pause with intention, a space left open so that something else may grow without interference. In ancient cosmology, silence often appears just before creation or just after destruction. It is the interval where nothing is demanded of the world, no rituals, no sacrifices, no commands, only waiting, only observation. This interval matters more than the event itself. If an elder civilization learned anything through repeated cycles, it may have been this: that intervention should be rare, that presence must sometimes yield to absence, that the most responsible action is often restraint disguised as withdrawal. This perspective reframes the very idea of progress. Progress ceases to mean accumulation and begins to mean calibration. Not how far a civilization can go, but how precisely it can move without destabilizing the whole. Such precision requires an intimate understanding of limits. Limits are uncomfortable. They contradict ambition. They frustrate power. But they are also the only reason systems survive complexity. Without limits, growth becomes noise. Expansion becomes distortion. Perhaps this is why the elders, in story and memory, never return. Not because they cannot, but because returning would violate the lesson they chose to embody. Presence would invite imitation. Imitation would invite repetition. Repetition would recreate the imbalance they stepped away from. So they remain silent. And silence, over time, becomes myth. Myth becomes metaphor. Metaphor becomes intuition. Intuition becomes a faint hesitation felt just before crossing certain thresholds. This hesitation may be the true inheritance, a quiet resistance that surfaces when humanity approaches irreversible change. A moment where speed slows, doubt enters, and questions emerge that were not asked before. Should we go further? Should we extract more? Should we alter this system simply because we can? These questions do not halt progress entirely, but they shape its contours. They introduce friction into momentum. They prevent total acceleration. Antarctica, in this context, is not only a physical place, it is a psychological boundary, a reminder that some regions, some systems, some knowledge domains are not meant to be optimized aggressively. They are meant to remain stable. If the elders left anything beneath the ice, it may be less a message than a mirror, a reflection of how a mature civilization behaves when it finally understands its own reach. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply withdraws from positions of excess influence. This is not a dramatic ending. It is an ethical one. As the narrative continues, it will begin to examine the consequences of ignoring this inheritance, of civilizations that interpreted power as permission rather than responsibility, of cycles where restraint failed to take root. But for now, the story rests on this quiet turning point, the realization that silence can be an act of care, that absence can preserve balance more effectively than constant presence, and that if humanity is to encounter what was left behind, whether under ice or within itself, it will not happen through conquest or urgency. It will happen when we learn to trust silence enough to listen to what it has been holding all along. Listening long enough to silence eventually changes how consequence is understood. In younger civilizations, consequence is imagined as punishment, a response imposed from outside, a force that arrives suddenly and dramatically, often framed as judgment. But in older cosmologies, consequence is quieter. It is described as drift, as imbalance accumulating until correction becomes unavoidable. This distinction matters. Punishment can be resisted. Drift cannot. Drift happens slowly, invisibly, through small decisions repeated without reflection. A river redirected here, a forest thinned there, a system optimized just a little too far. Each change feels justified in isolation. Together, they bend the trajectory of the whole. The ancient stories seem deeply aware of this. They rarely depict catastrophe as random. It is almost always preceded by forgetting limits, forgetting timing, forgetting that the system itself has needs independent of human desire. When floods come, they come after warnings ignored. When fires descend, they follow excess. When the gods withdraw, it is after balance has been strained beyond what presence can repair. If an elder civilization truly understood drift, then its most important achievement would not be technological mastery, but the ability to detect early imbalance, to sense when accumulation was becoming distortion, to recognize when intervention needed to cease. This ability would feel like intuition to later observers, a gut sense that something is off, even when metrics suggest success, a discomfort with unchecked growth, a suspicion of solutions that promise permanence. Such intuition cannot be taught easily. It must be lived. That may be why the elders allowed forgetting, why they did not insist on preservation of their exact knowledge. They understood that wisdom copied mechanically loses its grounding. Only wisdom rediscovered through experience retains its ethical weight. So each cycle must relearn balance the hard way. Antarctica, still silent, still distant, becomes a marker of this long lesson. It sits outside ordinary cause and effect, yet exerts influence everywhere. It demonstrates that importance does not require visibility, that power does not require occupation. Modern civilization struggles with this concept. Influence, to us, is tied to presence, to activity, to constant engagement. But the planet operates differently. Its most powerful regulators are slow, cold, and largely ignored until they shift. Ice sheets, ocean currents, magnetic fields. These are not dramatic forces. They are persistent ones. If the elders aligned their legacy with such forces, then they chose a language the planet itself understands. Not symbols carved in stone, but participation in regulatory systems that endure regardless of human attention. This possibility reframes the search entirely. Instead of asking what object might be hidden beneath the ice, the more relevant question becomes what relationships were left intact, what balances were deliberately preserved. Perhaps the true inheritance is not something waiting to be activated, but something already operating quietly, provided it is not disrupted. And this brings the narrative to an uncomfortable mirror. If humanity, in its current phase, alters the very systems that maintain balance, then it is not uncovering the elders' legacy. It is erasing it, not through malice, through impatience. This is where the ancient warning grows sharper without becoming loud. Progress that ignores drift accelerates correction. Intervention without humility hastens withdrawal. The elders do not return to stop this. They never planned to. The lesson was never enforced. It was offered. And like all offerings in deep time, it waits to be accepted not when curiosity peaks, but when restraint finally feels necessary. When restraint finally feels necessary, it often arrives not as wisdom, but as fatigue. Civilizations do not slow down because they suddenly become enlightened. They slow down because acceleration begins to hurt. Systems strain, resources thin, meaning fragments. The future starts to feel narrow instead of open. Only then does the question surface, quietly but persistently. Is this pace sustainable? Ancient cosmology understood this moment well. It framed fatigue not as failure, but as signal. When the gods grow tired, when the sky darkens, when the land no longer responds as it once did, these are not punishments. They are communications. The system is telling its participants that something must change. Modern culture often misses this language. We treat fatigue as an obstacle to overcome rather than a message to interpret. We respond with more efficiency, more extraction, more control. But this response only deepens the imbalance. The elders, if they existed as a coherent civilization or as a long accumulation of insight, may have recognized fatigue as sacred information, a threshold beyond which intervention becomes irresponsible. To continue would be to privilege continuity of power over continuity of life. So they stop. Stopping does not mean disappearance overnight. It means disengagement. It means relinquishing certain capabilities. It means choosing not to apply knowledge simply because it exists. This is an act almost unimaginable to modern frameworks of progress. Yet in myth, this act appears again and again. The fire is returned to the heavens. The tools are broken or buried. The teachers leave without successors. The world is allowed to forget what it cannot yet use responsibly. This forgetting is not total. It is selective. Enough memory remains to inspire rebuilding, not enough to repeat the same mistakes with greater force. Antarctica, again, mirrors this principle with eerie clarity. It is not erased from the world. It is simply disengaged. Present, influential, but not exploited. It participates without performing. It regulates without announcing. To align a legacy with such a place is to accept invisibility as success. This is difficult for a civilization accustomed to monuments and records. We equate legacy with visibility. We carve names into stone. We build upward to be seen, but the elders, if they chose silence, inverted this instinct. They trusted that what mattered would persist without attribution. This trust extends into the future. It assumes that intelligence, given enough cycles, will eventually rediscover humility. That suffering will teach what instruction could not. That collapse will strip away illusions until balance becomes desirable rather than restrictive. From this vantage point, the resets described in myth no longer look like tragedies inflicted from above. They look like system resets triggered by accumulated drift, automatic corrections built into the architecture of the world. The elders did not cause them. They anticipated them. And anticipation allows preparation without panic. Preparation, in this story, does not mean survival of individuals or structures. It means survival of orientation, of the ability to read the signs when they appear again, of the instinct to step back rather than push forward at the wrong moment. As humanity stands within its own accelerating cycle, these ancient intuitions begin to surface once more, not as religion, not as prophecy, but as unease, a feeling that something essential is being strained. Whether this unease becomes wisdom depends on what follows, on whether fatigue is honored as information or dismissed as weakness. The ice does not intervene. It waits to see whether the signal will finally be heard. Hearing the signal is never a sudden event. It unfolds gradually, like pressure equalizing after a long imbalance. In the ancient imagination, this moment is often described as an age turning, not because a date is reached, but because perception shifts. What once felt distant begins to feel urgent. What once felt invincible begins to feel fragile. Confidence softens into caution. This is the threshold where cycles become visible. Civilizations usually mistake this visibility for crisis alone, but crisis is only the surface expression. Beneath it lies a deeper realization that the world has limits that cannot be negotiated, only respected, that complexity cannot grow indefinitely without reorganizing itself. That intelligence, left unchecked, will optimize systems until they lose resilience. The elders, in their silence, seem to have understood this inevitability. They did not imagine a final victory over entropy. They accepted entropy as a partner, something to work with, not defeat. This acceptance is difficult to reconcile with modern narratives of progress. We are conditioned to believe that every problem has a solution, that every limit is temporary, that innovation will always arrive in time. But deep time tells a different story. Innovation can delay correction, but it cannot cancel it. Correction always arrives eventually. The ancient myths encode this not as despair, but as rhythm. Ages follow ages. Worlds are made, undone, and made again. Each iteration carries forward a trace of what came before, not as continuity of form, but as refinement of understanding. If Antarctica holds any role in this refinement, it is as a witness. A place that has seen climates shift, seas rise and fall, life retreat and return. It has no allegiance to any one age. It endures across them. To align a legacy with such a witness is to think beyond generations, beyond species, perhaps beyond civilization itself. It is to ask not how to survive the next catastrophe, but how to ensure that something meaningful remains intelligible afterward. Meaning is fragile. It erodes faster than stone. So the elders may have chosen to encode meaning not in language, which changes, but in relationships, between ice and ocean, between tilt and season, between orbit and climate. These relationships do not require translation. They operate whether they are understood or not. This is a sobering thought. It suggests that the most important knowledge may be invisible to those who look only for artifacts. It lives in patterns that must be observed patiently across scales of time that challenge human attention. As humanity's tools grow more powerful, this patience becomes harder to sustain. Speed fragments awareness. Data overwhelms intuition. Signals drown in noise, and yet, occasionally, the noise drops. In moments of pause, of collective uncertainty, the old questions return. Are we pushing too far? Are we mistaking control for understanding? Are we exhausting the systems that allow us to exist? These questions do not come from fear alone. They come from a deeper memory, one that recognizes the shape of the cycle even if it cannot name it. The elder's silence does not answer these questions. It amplifies them. It leaves humanity alone with its responsibility, and responsibility once felt cannot be undone. As this act continues to unfold, the story will move toward the great corrections remembered in myth. Floods, fires, collapses that are less about punishment and more about rebalancing. Moments when the planet asserts its rhythms and civilizations are forced to respond. But before that happens, there is always this pause, this quiet interval where listening is still possible, where restraint could still change the shape of what comes next. In every cycle remembered by myth, the pause before correction is the most fragile moment. It is fragile because nothing has broken yet. The world still functions. Systems still operate. Life continues with enough familiarity to convince its participants that adaptation can wait. And yet, beneath the surface, pressures have already aligned. Thresholds have been crossed quietly, without ceremony. The ancient stories often describe this moment with strange tenderness. There are warnings, but they are subtle. Dreams, omens, changes in animal behavior, shifts in weather that feel slightly out of place. The signs are not dramatic enough to force action, only enough to invite reflection. Reflection, however, is costly. It demands slowing down. It asks a civilization to question its assumptions while it still benefits from them. Few societies manage this willingly. The elders, if they existed beyond metaphor, may have recognized this pattern too well. They would have known that once momentum builds past a certain point, choice narrows. Correction becomes inevitable, not because intelligence failed, but because it arrived too late. This is why anticipation matters more than reaction in deep time. Anticipation allows withdrawal without collapse. It allows preparation without panic. It allows meaning to be set aside gently rather than ripped away violently. If a system like 3i Atlas is imagined as part of this story, it would not be designed to stop catastrophe. It would be designed to recognize approach, to signal when accumulation has become distortion, to indicate when intervention must give way to restraint. Such a system would feel disappointing to a culture seeking control. It would not promise salvation. It would not offer dominance. It would simply say, now is the time to stop. Stopping is not heroic in most narratives. It does not inspire monuments or songs. It leaves no dramatic victory. But in the long memory of the planet, stopping at the right moment may be the most consequential act a civilization can perform. The ancient floods remembered across cultures follow this logic. They do not arrive randomly. They come after warnings dismissed. They cleanse not because they are cruel, but because accumulation has reached saturation. The system resets because no further adjustment is possible without rupture. In these stories, survival is never universal. Something is always lost. But something is always carried forward as well. Seeds, families, stories. A reduced version of the world, simpler, quieter, stripped of excess. What survives is not what was strongest, but what was adaptable. This is an uncomfortable inheritance. It suggests that resilience matters more than brilliance, that humility outlasts power, that the ability to let go determines what continues. The elders' silence fits this inheritance perfectly. They do not argue for a particular future. They simply refuse to interfere once the pause has passed. They trust the system to correct itself and trust survivors to rebuild within new limits. As humanity approaches its own thresholds, these ancient patterns feel less abstract. The idea of reset no longer belongs only to myth. It appears in conversations about climate, resources, stability, different language, same underlying tension. The pause is still here. The question is whether it will be used. The ice remains unchanged, holding its layers of time, indifferent to human urgency. It has seen pauses wasted before. It has seen corrections arrive regardless. And yet, as always, it waits through this one too. Because in deep time, waiting is not hope. It is simply how the system allows choice to exist for as long as possible. Choice, when extended to its final moment, carries a peculiar weight. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with certainty. It often feels indistinguishable from hesitation, and that is why it is so easily overlooked. In the ancient cycles, this moment passes quietly. The world does not end when the pause expires. It simply begins to move differently. Systems that once absorbed pressure begin to transmit it. Stability gives way to acceleration. Events that seemed unrelated start to converge. The elders, if they were watching at all, would not intervene here. Intervention after convergence only amplifies damage. The only meaningful action exists before alignment locks into place. This is the hard truth embedded in myth. Warnings are not meant to save everyone. They are meant to preserve continuity. Continuity does not require that a civilization survive intact. It requires that something essential survives the transition. A way of seeing, a way of relating, a memory of balance that can seed the next beginning. The floods remembered across continents do not wash everything away. They simplify. They compress. They erase excess while leaving structure beneath the surface. When waters recede, the land is not empty. It is quieter, more readable. This is where humanity always re-enters the story, not as masters of a new world, but as listeners in a simplified one. If Antarctica symbolizes anything within this cycle, it symbolizes that compression, a place where layers stack, pressure builds, and nothing escapes the weight of time. Yet within that weight, information is preserved with astonishing fidelity. Ice remembers. It remembers atmospheres long gone. It remembers fires no human witnessed. It remembers worlds that existed before language. This memory is not narrative. It is relational. It tells you how the planet responded when conditions changed. A civilization that learned to read such memory would understand resets not as failures, but as transitions. necessary compressions that allow complexity to reorganize without collapsing entirely. This understanding reframes loss. Loss is not annihilation. It is reduction. Reduction removes noise. And in the quiet that follows, something old becomes audible again. Perhaps this is why the idea of a hidden legacy beneath the ice feels so persistent. It resonates with an intuition that knowledge survives best when it is not crowded by excess. That wisdom requires space. That after collapse, what remains must be simple enough to be carried forward without distortion. The elders, in stepping back, may have trusted this process more than any archive or instruction. They may have believed that the planet itself was the safest carrier of memory. As the second act of this narrative draws to a close, the stage is set for correction, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. The forces described in myth do not act out of anger. They act because balance demands movement. What comes next in the story is not destruction for its own sake. It is reorganization, a clearing, a reset that makes room for the next question humanity must answer. Not how to prevent change, but how to remember, through change, what matters enough to bring forward. Reorganization begins without announcement. There is no single moment when the world declares a reset. No signal that can be clearly marked as the turning point. Instead, familiar patterns begin to fail quietly. Seasons arrive late or early. Waters behave differently. Winds shift their habits. What once felt reliable starts to feel uncertain, and uncertainty spreads faster than fear. In the ancient stories, this phase is remembered as unease rather than catastrophe, a sense that the ground itself is reconsidering its agreements, that the old arrangements between sky, land, and life are loosening. This is where the idea of primordial forces re-enters the narrative, not as gods in the human sense, but as deep mechanisms: gravity, heat, water, ice, fire, forces that do not negotiate but respond. When balance drifts too far, response becomes unavoidable, not out of judgment, but out of physics. Water rises because ice melts. Ice advances because heat withdraws. Fire spreads because dryness accumulates. None of these are moral acts. They are corrections. The ancient mind understood this intuitively. It did not separate the natural from the sacred. A flood was not merely water. It was the world reasserting proportion. A fire was not merely destruction. It was renewal through reduction. When these forces gather momentum, civilizations discover a painful truth. Complexity is fragile. It depends on stability. When stability falters, complexity collapses quickly, leaving behind simpler forms that can survive volatility. This is not the end of life. It is the end of excess. If an elder civilization anticipated this, it would have known that no structure, no matter how advanced, could withstand a full planetary correction. Survival would not belong to the strongest, but to the most adaptable, to those positioned at the margins, to those already living simply. This understanding reshapes the meaning of preparation. Preparation is not fortification. It is simplification. It is reducing dependency on systems that require constant stability to function. In myth, this becomes the image of chosen survivors, not chosen by favor, but by fit. They live close enough to the land to respond. They carry knowledge lightly enough to move. They are not burdened by monuments. The flood narratives across cultures preserve this image carefully. The ark, the mountain refuge, the high ground. These are not symbols of escape. They are symbols of transition, vessels that carry life through a narrowing world. Antarctica, distant and silent, stands outside these immediate dramas. But its role in the planetary system becomes even more pronounced during correction. Ice sheets expand or contract. Sea levels respond. Currents shift. The cold places quietly reorganize the warm ones. This is why Antarctica feels like an anchor in the story. Not because it causes catastrophe, but because it mediates it. It absorbs excess energy. It redistributes imbalance. It slows certain changes while accelerating others. If knowledge was aligned with this place, it would not be knowledge of domination. It would be knowledge of mediation, how to live within correction rather than against it. As the narrative moves fully into catastrophe and reset, the tone does not sharpen. It remains calm, because panic belongs to individuals, not to systems. The planet does not panic. It adjusts, and within that adjustment, humanity is reduced to a simpler question. What can endure movement? What can float when the ground shifts? What can remember itself when the world forgets its previous shape? The answer is never everything. It is always enough. Enough is a word that only makes sense after excess has been stripped away. When the great corrections remembered in myth finally unfold, they do not erase the world. They reduce it to scale. Vast networks collapse into local relations. Long chains of dependency shorten. Life returns to proximity with land, water, and sky. This reduction is often described as devastation, but within the deeper rhythm of cycles, it is also clarification. After floods, shorelines are redrawn. After ice advances, landscapes are flattened. After fire, soil opens itself again to seed. These are not acts of cruelty. They are acts of rebalancing that remove complexity the system can no longer support. Human memory tends to linger on the trauma of these transitions, not on what follows. But myth preserves both. After the waters recede, planting resumes. After the cold retreats, animals return. After the ash settles, forests rise again. What emerges is never identical to what was lost, but it is often more stable. The elders, if they foresaw this process, may have accepted loss as inevitable and focused instead on continuity of orientation. They would have known that survivors do not need blueprints for a vanished world. They need ways of reading the new one. This is why ancient survivors are so often portrayed as listeners rather than builders. They watch the sky. They test the soil. They observe animals. They relearn patterns patiently without assuming the old rules still apply. In this phase, memory becomes dangerous if it clings too tightly to what no longer exists. Nostalgia can be fatal. It tempts survivors to rebuild structures unsuited to altered conditions. So forgetting plays a necessary role. Not total forgetting, but selective forgetting. Letting go of methods while retaining sensibilities, releasing forms while preserving values. Remembering balance without remembering the exact shape it once took. Antarctica, enduring through cycles, reflects this principle again. It does not remember landscapes in detail. It remembers climates. It does not preserve cities. It preserves conditions. If something was aligned with that memory, then it would not teach how to rebuild the old world. It would teach how to sense when the new world is ready. Perhaps that is the function of a system imagined as 3-eye atlas within this narrative. Not a device that survives catastrophe intact, but a conceptual compass, a way of orienting perception toward cycles rather than events. Such a compass would be invaluable after a reset. When history is fragmented and knowledge uneven, a sense of timing can guide reconstruction more effectively than any archive. The ancient survivors remembered in myth often live simply at first. They build modestly. They avoid overreach. Their stories emphasize caution, not ambition. This is not because they are ignorant. It is because they are attentive. Attention is the rarest resource after catastrophe. The world has changed. Old assumptions no longer hold. Attention allows adaptation without panic. It allows new stability to form organically rather than being imposed. As the narrative continues deeper into the reset, it becomes clear that catastrophe is not the central drama. The central drama is what follows: how humanity responds when the illusion of permanence has been removed, whether it rebuilds with humility, or whether it rushes to recreate complexity before the ground is ready to hold it again. The ice has witnessed both outcomes before. It knows how this part of the story can unfold. And it remains silent, allowing choice to return slowly, one careful step at a time. Choice, after a reset, returns in fragments. It does not arrive as freedom in the modern sense. It arrives as necessity. Survivors choose where to settle based on water and shelter. They choose when to plant based on unfamiliar skies. They choose which stories to carry forward because memory has become heavy and selective. This is where a new cycle truly begins. In the myths, this phase is quiet. The drama has passed. The waters have receded. The fires have burned themselves out. What remains is a world stripped of excess signal, a landscape where cause and effect are visible again. In such a world, attention sharpens. People notice details that were once ignored: the direction of winds, the behavior of animals, the return of certain stars at dawn. Survival depends not on dominance, but on sensitivity. Those who listen thrive. Those who impose old patterns struggle. If an elder civilization intended anything to survive into this phase, it would have been this sensitivity. Not instructions carved in stone, but an orientation toward observation. A way of inhabiting the world that prioritizes feedback over ambition. This is why post-reset cultures often appear cautious in the archaeological record. Their early phases show restraint. Tools are simple. Settlements are modest. Symbolism focuses on cycles rather than conquest. Time is tracked carefully. The sky regains its central role. This caution does not last forever. As stability returns, memory fades. New generations grow up without direct experience of correction. They inherit stories without the fear that gave those stories weight. Gradually, ambition returns. Complexity rebuilds. The cycle begins to accelerate again. But something subtle has been altered. Each reset leaves behind a residue of awareness, a faint imprint that influences how quickly excess accumulates next time. Over many cycles, this residue may refine the species itself. Not biologically in any dramatic sense, but culturally and psychologically. Humanity becomes slightly more capable of sensing drift. This is slow evolution, too slow to prevent every collapse, but sufficient to ensure that something is learned each time. Antarctica, unchanged through these cycles, acts as a fixed reference point. While civilizations rise and fall elsewhere, the ice maintains continuity. It witnesses shifts without participating in them. Its memory does not belong to any one culture. It belongs to the planet. To align a legacy with such a witness is to think beyond survival. It is to think in terms of guidance that does not require enforcement, of memory that does not require belief. Perhaps that is why the idea of rediscovery feels more appropriate than discovery. Nothing new is being found. Something old is being recognized again under different conditions. As humanity rebuilds after each reset, the same questions re-emerge in new forms. How much is enough? How far is too far? When does improvement become imbalance? The answers are never final. They are negotiated anew in each age. But the presence of those questions at all suggests that the inheritance is working, that silence has shaped behavior, that absence has influenced choice. And so the story does not move toward revelation. It moves toward repetition. A repetition that is not identical, but informed. A cycle that remembers just enough to turn slightly differently each time. Whether that slight turn is enough in the end, remains open. The ice does not predict. It only preserves the possibility that learning, however slow, is not entirely lost. What remains after repetition is not certainty, but character. Each cycle leaves humanity slightly altered, shaped not by what it built, but by what it endured. The memory of collapse does not survive intact, but it leaves behind habits, a tendency toward caution, a suspicion of unchecked abundance, a quiet respect for forces that do not answer to human desire. These habits are fragile. They erode quickly once stability returns. But they do not vanish completely. They surface as taboos, as sacred boundaries, as stories warning against hubris, as laws that limit kings, as calendars that interrupt labor with rest. These are not moral inventions. They are structural adaptations, learned through loss. In the wake of resets, civilizations often re-establish contact with the sky. Astronomy returns not as curiosity, but as necessity. The heavens provide timing when terrestrial patterns are unfamiliar. They offer continuity when landscapes have been rearranged. This return to the sky is one of the clearest signals that a new cycle has begun. Calendars are rebuilt. Seasons are remeasured. Festivals mark alignments rather than anniversaries. Time becomes circular again, not because people reject progress, but because circular time reflects the world they inhabit. Linear narratives emerge later, when stability allows the illusion of permanence. If an elder legacy exists within this pattern, it would be most active during these early phases, not as instruction, but as resonance. Survivors intuitively prioritize balance. They sense, without explanation, that certain thresholds should not be crossed too quickly. This intuition does not feel like obedience to ancient law. It feels like common sense. Common sense is often inherited wisdom, whose origin has been forgotten. Antarctica, unaltered through these transitions, becomes a silent constant against which change can be measured. Its ice record shifts in atmosphere and temperature, but it does not interpret them. It does not tell a story. It preserves evidence. Evidence without narrative is powerful. It allows future intelligence to draw its own conclusions rather than inheriting fixed meaning. Perhaps this is why the idea of hidden records beneath the ice feels both compelling and unnecessary. Compelling because we hunger for confirmation. Unnecessary because the confirmation may already exist in the planet's own memory, waiting to be read with patience rather than excavated with urgency. As humanity rebuilds layer by layer, complexity returns. Trade networks expand. Surpluses accumulate. Specialization deepens. Eventually, confidence follows, and with confidence, the old temptations reappear. The cycle accelerates again, but it does not accelerate from zero. It accelerates from memory, however faint. This faint memory alters outcomes at the margins. A city may still fall, but a language survives. An empire may collapse, but an idea persists. A catastrophe may erase records, but not instincts. Over vast spans of time, these marginal survivals add up. They do not prevent collapse, but they soften it. They make renewal more likely. This is slow progress, not the progress of conquest or invention, but the progress of awareness. The elders, if they ever existed as more than metaphor, may have trusted this slow accumulation more than any direct intervention. They may have believed that wisdom cannot be delivered whole. It must be earned repeatedly. And so the legacy, whatever its form, does not rush to reveal itself. It allows humanity to stumble, recover, and try again, because only through repetition does restraint stop feeling imposed and begin to feel chosen. Choice, when it begins to feel chosen rather than imposed, marks a subtle turning in the long cycle. At this stage, humanity is no longer merely reacting to catastrophe. It is reflecting on it. The stories told after the rebuilding begin to shift tone. They are no longer only about survival. They are about restraint remembered as wisdom rather than fear. This is where interpretation enters the narrative. Symbols that once described literal events become metaphors. Floods are no longer only waters. They become warnings about excess. Fires become lessons about purification. The withdrawal of gods becomes an allegory for limits placed on power. Interpretation allows memory to travel farther than facts ever could. Facts demand accuracy. Interpretation adapts. If an elder legacy was intended to endure across many resets, it would have relied on interpretation rather than instruction. It would allow each generation to extract meaning suited to its context without being bound to obsolete forms. This flexibility is essential. A rigid legacy breaks when conditions change. A flexible one reshapes itself invisibly. As civilizations grow again, interpretation deepens. Philosophies emerge. Ethical systems form. Laws begin to encode balance rather than brute authority. The idea that power must justify itself appears again and again, even in societies that later abandon it. These ideas do not descend from a single source. They surface independently across cultures that have never met. This recurrence is often explained as coincidence or shared human psychology, but it can also be read as convergence. Different societies arriving at similar conclusions because they are responding to the same underlying pressures. Pressure teaches. The elders, if they trusted pressure more than control, may have allowed this convergence deliberately. They would not need to leave one unified doctrine. They would only need to ensure that the system continued to generate the same lessons when strained. Antarctica, immutable and extreme, remains a teacher of this kind. It does not lecture. It does not adapt to human preference. It demonstrates consequence without intention. Its ice responds to heat. Its mass influences oceans. Its presence shapes weather far beyond its borders. It is impossible to ignore forever. This is why, in modern times, attention drifts back toward it. Not because something new has appeared there, but because humanity has reached another interpretive threshold. The systems we depend on are straining again. The signs are familiar, even if the language describing them is new. Once more, the inherited questions surface. How much alteration can the system absorb? Where are the points of no return? What must be preserved at all costs, and what must be allowed to change? These questions do not demand answers in the form of machines or revelations. They demand posture, orientation, a willingness to see restraint as intelligence rather than failure. In this phase of the cycle, the temptation is interpretation without humility, to believe that understanding a pattern grants the right to override it. This temptation has ended many cycles prematurely. The elders' silence warns against this without speaking. It suggests that recognition alone is not maturity. Maturity lies in response. As the narrative moves forward, it will begin to examine what happens when interpretation turns into appropriation, when symbolic understanding is converted back into control, when cycles are mapped not to respect them but to exploit them. This is where the story grows more precarious, because the difference between stewardship and domination is often a single decision, made quietly, long before consequences appear. And once that decision is made, the cycle does not argue. It simply continues. When interpretation hardens into appropriation, the cycle begins to tilt again. This shift is subtle. It does not announce itself as domination. It often presents itself as stewardship, as optimization, as responsibility taken seriously. Knowledge that once guided restraint is reinterpreted as permission. Understanding becomes leverage. In ancient stories, this moment is often depicted as hubris returning quietly. Humanity begins to believe it can manage what was once respected. Cycles are charted not to align with them, but to predict and exploit them. Sacred timings become schedules. Thresholds become targets. The difference is not in the data, it is in the intent. Where restraint once guided action, control now motivates it. And control, no matter how carefully justified, accelerates drift. If an elder civilization encountered this temptation in its own time, it may have recognized how difficult it is to resist. Knowledge invites use. Insight invites intervention. Even the desire to protect can become intrusive if it overrides the system's own capacity to self-correct. This is the paradox of advanced awareness. The more clearly a system is understood, the more tempting it becomes to override its natural rhythms in the name of efficiency or safety. The myths preserve this paradox carefully. Those who seek to climb the heavens are scattered. Those who steal fire pay a price. Those who attempt to extend a golden age indefinitely trigger its end. These are not moral condemnations. They are systemic warnings. The world tolerates guidance. It resists control. Antarctica, again, illustrates this distinction with clarity. Studying it yields insight into climate, circulation, and planetary balance. Exploiting it would destabilize systems far beyond its borders. Knowledge invites humility. Extraction invites consequence. The elders' silence seems calibrated to this boundary. They do not forbid understanding. They discourage possession. They do not deny access forever. They deny premature access. This distinction may explain why the legacy feels incomplete, why myths hint but do not explain, why symbols gesture but do not resolve. The gaps are not failures of transmission. They are safeguards. A complete system, delivered whole, would invite misuse. An incomplete one requires discernment. As humanity advances through successive cycles, it repeatedly encounters this test. Will it use understanding to harmonize or to dominate? Will it allow complexity to breathe, or will it optimize until resilience collapses? The answers vary by era, by culture, by moment. No cycle is entirely one or the other, but the overall trajectory is shaped by how often restraint is chosen when exploitation is possible. In this phase of the narrative, the elders are no longer central characters. Their role has been fulfilled. They have withdrawn far enough that humanity must confront its own reflection without guidance. This is uncomfortable. It removes the possibility of blame. If balance fails now, it will not be because knowledge was hidden. It will be because knowledge was used without humility. The ice does not intervene to prevent this. It does not accelerate correction to teach a lesson. It responds only when thresholds are crossed. Until then, it waits. Because waiting preserves choice. And choice, once made freely, carries consequences that no warning can undo. The cycle does not punish the decision. It simply moves forward with it, reshaping the world around the path that was taken. Once a choice has been made, the world begins to respond long before the response is noticed. At first, the changes seem manageable. Systems compensate. Buffers absorb stress. The appearance of control is maintained, and with it, confidence. But beneath this surface stability, thresholds approach quietly. Feedback loops tighten. Margins thin. In the ancient imagination, this phase is remembered as false calm. The sky still turns, crops still grow, cities still function. But the rhythm has shifted just enough to create tension. What once recovered easily now requires constant intervention. What once balanced itself must be managed. Management replaces trust. This is where complexity becomes brittle. The elders, having withdrawn long before this stage, do not appear in these stories as rescuers. They are absent not because they are indifferent, but because return would only deepen dependency. The system must be allowed to show its limits clearly, without interference. When correction finally arrives, it is rarely singular. It unfolds through convergence. Multiple stresses align. Climatic shifts coincide with resource strain. Social structures fracture under pressure they were never designed to bear simultaneously. This convergence feels sudden only in hindsight. Myth compresses it into dramatic imagery. A great flood, a consuming fire, a sky that falls. But beneath the metaphor lies a recognizable pattern. Correction is cumulative. It is the sum of many ignored signals arriving at once. What survives this convergence is not accidental. Those positioned closer to balance endure. Those dependent on excess falter. Mobility outlasts rigidity. Diversity outlasts specialization pushed too far. Simplicity regains value. After the correction passes, humanity does not emerge enlightened. It emerges humbled enough to listen again. This is the quiet reset that matters more than the dramatic one. The resetting of assumptions, the recalibration of what feels necessary, the rediscovery of limits as guides rather than constraints. Antarctica, enduring through all of this, remains unchanged in its role. It neither accelerates nor delays correction. It records it. Its ice captures shifts in atmosphere. Its mass responds to temperature. Its presence reshapes oceans without intention. It is indifferent, but not irrelevant. If any wisdom is preserved there, it is preserved in the way the planet itself remembers. Without narrative, without judgment. Only cause and effect held patiently in layers. As humanity rebuilds once more, the cycle resumes. Knowledge is reassembled, stories are retold, meaning is reinterpreted. The elders remain silent. Their silence is not abandonment, it is consistency. They do not interrupt the learning process once it has begun. They allow consequence to teach what warning could not. And in that allowance lies the final test of maturity. Not whether humanity can avoid every collapse, but whether it can rebuild without repeating the same decision that made collapse inevitable. The cycle waits to see, as it always has. Waiting, after correction, is different from waiting before it. Before the reset, waiting feels tense, charged with anticipation, filled with arguments about prevention and control. After the reset, waiting becomes acceptance. The world has changed and there is no appeal. Only adaptation remains. This is where the deepest shift occurs. Survivors no longer ask how to restore what was lost. They ask how to live within what remains. The land answers slowly. The climate offers new patterns. The sky resumes its guidance, unchanged in its cycles, but altered in its implications. Here, humility is no longer an abstract virtue. It is practical. It shapes where people settle, what they build, how much they take. Excess feels dangerous now, not because of stories, but because memory is still close enough to hurt. This is the moment when the inherited legacy, if it exists at all, is most active. Not as a revelation, as alignment. Human behavior briefly synchronizes with planetary rhythm. Actions are smaller, planning is shorter. Observation outweighs ambition. For a time, the system breathes. In myth, this phase is rarely celebrated. It lacks spectacle. There are no heroes, no empires, no monuments. There is only survival refined into sustainability. But this is the phase that determines the character of the next age. If restraint holds long enough, complexity returns gradually, shaped by new limits. If restraint fades too quickly, drift begins again almost immediately. The elders, watching only through memory and consequence, would recognize this pattern instantly. They would know that no intervention is needed here. The system is doing exactly what it is designed to do. Teach through experience. Antarctica, still unchanged, becomes a symbol of this post-reset clarity. It stands as proof that endurance does not require dominance, that influence does not require presence, that stability can exist without growth. To imagine something preserved, there is to imagine a message that says nothing more than this. You do not need to be everywhere to matter. You do not need to last forever to be meaningful. You do not need to control the system to belong within it. These are not instructions, they are recognitions. As this act of catastrophe and reset closes, the narrative does not rush forward. It lingers in this quiet aftermath where the world is simpler, but not empty, where meaning is not abundant, but sufficient. The cycle has turned. What comes next will not be shaped by what was destroyed. It will be shaped by what is remembered. And memory, as always, will decide whether the silence left behind by the elders becomes a guide or is slowly filled again by the same old noise. What is remembered after silence returns is rarely precise. Memory, after a reset, does not preserve detail. It preserves direction. It does not recall exact events. It recalls feelings, a sense of what went wrong, a quiet agreement about what should not be rushed again. This is where interpretation becomes unavoidable. Humanity begins to tell stories not only about what happened, but about what it meant. Symbols replace records. Myths stand in for timelines. The literal dissolves, and the essential remains. From this distance, the question of whether ancient stories describe real catastrophes or symbolic ones becomes less important. What matters is that they function as warnings encoded to survive forgetting. Floods warn against accumulation. Fires warn against excess. Fallen skies warn against overreach. These warnings do not require belief to operate. They shape behavior simply by existing. As cycles repeat, interpretation grows more abstract. The same stories are told in philosophical language. Balance becomes an ethical principle. Moderation becomes virtue. Hubris becomes a flaw of character rather than a technical error. This shift marks the transition from myth to theory. It is here that modern speculation enters the story. When contemporary minds look back at ancient knowledge systems, they often ask whether those systems were symbolic or literal, whether gods were metaphors or visitors, whether lost technologies existed or whether stories exaggerated human imagination. These questions are natural, but they may miss the deeper point. A system designed to survive resets would not privilege literal accuracy. Literal accuracy decays quickly. It would privilege resilience of meaning. It would allow truth to migrate across forms, disguising itself as religion, philosophy, or science as conditions demand. In this sense, the idea of something like Three-Eye Atlas becomes less about hardware and more about interpretive structure, a way of organizing understanding around cycles rather than events. A framework that remains useful regardless of whether it is expressed through myth or mathematics. If such a framework ever existed explicitly, it may not survive intact. It would fragment. Pieces would embed themselves in different cultures, disciplines, and intuitions. No one would hold the whole. This fragmentation would be intentional. A complete system in the hands of a single culture invites misuse. A distributed system forces collaboration across time, language, and worldview. It slows exploitation. It encourages humility. Antarctica, still present but distant, aligns with this logic again. It is a place no one culture controls. It exists beyond borders. Its governance even now relies on restraint rather than ownership. That this arrangement emerged unconsciously does not make it accidental. It suggests that inherited caution still operates beneath modern decision-making. The ice continues to shape climate not because it is worshipped, but because it is left largely alone. Perhaps that is the lesson returning now through speculation rather than catastrophe. The idea that some systems are safest when they are not optimized. That knowledge does not always demand application. That restraint can be an active choice rather than a failure of ambition. As interpretation deepens, the story becomes less about what happened long ago and more about how meaning survives long enough to be useful again. The elders no longer matter as figures. What matters is whether their silence has shaped a mindset capable of hearing itself think. The cycle has entered its reflective phase, not because answers have been found, but because the right questions are being asked again, quietly, without urgency. And in deep time, that is often the only sign that something important has endured. Reflection, once it settles into a civilization, changes the pace of thought. The urgency that drove earlier cycles begins to soften. Questions are no longer asked only to solve immediate problems. They are asked to understand context, why patterns repeat, why civilizations rise fully formed and then fracture along familiar lines, why knowledge feels rediscovered rather than invented. This is where theory emerges from memory. Humanity begins to suspect that history is not linear, but layered, that beneath recorded time lie other timelines, compressed, erased, and partially remembered through myth and intuition. The past stops feeling distant and starts feeling adjacent. In this phase, the idea of a prior civilization becomes less threatening. It no longer challenges identity. It deepens it. To imagine predecessors is not to diminish the present, but to situate it within a longer continuum. Speculation becomes careful, not because evidence is overwhelming, but because humility has returned as a value. The question is no longer what can be proven, but what patterns are too consistent to ignore. Civilizations appearing with advanced calendars, architectures aligned with celestial mechanics, myths describing global floods across disconnected cultures, knowledge of cycles embedded in ritual rather than record. Individually, these are curiosities. Together, they suggest inheritance, not inheritance of devices or blueprints, but of orientation, a way of approaching the world that survives destruction precisely because it does not insist on being recognized as truth. This is where symbolic and literal interpretations begin to overlap. A flood can be both a real event and a metaphor. A god can be both a force of nature and a memory of systemic function. A lost continent can be both geography and state of being. The mistake of modern thinking is often to demand exclusivity, either this or that, fact or fiction. But deep time does not operate in binaries. It preserves meaning through overlap. If Antarctica is imagined as an archive, it does not need to contain cities or machines to fulfill that role. Its existence alone preserves context. It reminds humanity that the planet has phases, that climate can transform entire worlds, that stability is conditional. And if a conceptual system like 3i Atlas exists within this narrative, it exists as synthesis, a convergence of observation, myth, and restraint. A reminder that intelligence once learned to map cycles not to escape them, but to live within them. Such a system would not announce itself with clarity. It would reveal itself slowly through convergence of disciplines. Astronomy aligning with geology, climate science echoing ancient calendars, ecology reflecting old taboos. Recognition would feel gradual, almost anticlimactic. No moment of discovery, only a growing sense that something long ignored is becoming visible again. This is the phase humanity may be entering now, not a revelation phase, but a remembering phase, where the pieces are not assembled into a final answer, but arranged into a better question. How do we live in a world that resets? How do we build knowing what the planet can undo? How do we preserve meaning without demanding permanence? The elders, if they ever stood at this same threshold, chose silence over instruction. They trusted the cycle to teach. Now, humanity stands in reflection, close enough to hear that lesson again. Whether it listens long enough to change course remains open. Deep time does not rush the answer. It allows the question to echo, slowly, until it reshapes the one asking it. Reflection, when sustained, begins to dissolve the need for certainty. In this phase of the cycle, humanity grows less interested in definitive answers and more attentive to coherence. The question is no longer whether ancient stories are true in a literal sense, but whether they are useful as lenses, whether they reveal something about how the world behaves when stretched beyond its limits. This shift is subtle, but profound. Certainty seeks closure. Coherence seeks relationship. A civilization oriented toward coherence does not demand final explanations. It tolerates ambiguity. It allows multiple interpretations to coexist without rushing to collapse them into a single doctrine. This tolerance is not weakness. It is resilience. Deep time favors such minds. When patterns are examined across thousands of years, it becomes clear that no single narrative survives intact. What survives are tendencies, recurrent shapes of behavior, familiar arcs of rise, excess, correction, and renewal. This recognition transforms speculation into responsibility. If cycles exist, then participation matters. Choices are no longer isolated. They echo forward and backward, influencing not only outcomes, but the quality of what is inherited. In this light, the idea of ancient custodians or elders loses its mystique. They no longer appear as superior beings withholding knowledge. They appear as participants who reached a moment of decision and chose restraint. Their silence stops feeling ominous. It starts feeling ethical. To remain silent is to refuse control over the future. It is to acknowledge that wisdom imposed too early becomes tyranny. It is to trust that understanding must mature on its own terms. Antarctica, unchanged, reinforces this ethic simply by existing. It is not optimized. It is not productive in human terms. Yet its influence is vast. It stabilizes systems without asserting dominance. It contributes without consumption. This inversion of value is difficult for modern frameworks to integrate. Productivity is prized, efficiency is rewarded, growth is celebrated, but deep time offers a different metric: stability. Stability is not static. It is dynamic balance maintained through restraint. It requires less intervention, not more. It survives because it does not demand attention. If any inheritance persists beneath the ice, it may be this inversion itself, a quiet counter-argument to the idea that significance must be loud, visible, or accelerating. As humanity approaches new thresholds of capability, this counter-argument becomes increasingly relevant. Power now extends to planetary systems. Influence scales globally. Decisions once local now ripple everywhere. In such a context, ancient restraint stops being archaic. It becomes urgent. But urgency here does not mean speed. It means seriousness, a willingness to slow down enough to ask whether action is necessary at all. This is the paradox of maturity. As capacity increases, restraint becomes more valuable, not less. The elders, if remembered correctly through silence, understood this paradox. They stepped back not because they lacked power, but because they recognized its weight. Humanity now stands before a similar mirror. The reflection is not flattering. It shows both brilliance and blindness, innovation and impatience, awareness and denial intertwined. The cycle does not demand a verdict. It observes. And observation over long enough spans reveals whether reflection will deepen into wisdom or fracture back into ambition, repeating the familiar arc once more. Ambition, when it returns after reflection, rarely announces itself as excess. It arrives disguised as necessity, as protection, as responsibility taken seriously. The language changes, but the impulse is familiar. To secure the future by extending control into domains once left untouched. In every cycle, this moment feels justified. Humanity remembers collapse, but it also remembers fear, and fear convinces itself that foresight requires intervention, that understanding cycles grants the right to manage them, that knowing limits allows them to be pushed safely. This is where reflection is tested. The difference between stewardship and domination narrows again, not because knowledge is lost, but because confidence grows. The memory of correction fades just enough for ambition to regain its voice. Ancient stories encode this return carefully. They speak of second cities, second towers, second golden ages that promise to be wiser than the first. They rarely last. What changes from cycle to cycle is not the temptation, but the scale. Each age inherits more capability than the last. Each believes it can finally transcend the mistakes of its predecessors. And yet, the underlying system remains unchanged. The planet still responds to imbalance. Feedback loops still tighten. Thresholds still exist, indifferent to intention. If the elders understood anything deeply, it was this indifference, not cruelty. Indifference. The world does not reward good intentions when actions disrupt balance. It responds only to effect. This is why silence was chosen over instruction. Instruction invites loopholes. Silence forces interpretation. Interpretation forces responsibility. Antarctica, still distant and unyielding, embodies this lesson perfectly. It offers data without narrative, evidence without guidance. It does not tell humanity what to do with what it reveals. It only shows what has happened before. Ice cores do not argue. They record, and records, unlike prophecies, cannot be negotiated with. As humanity advances deeper into its reflective phase, it faces a subtle danger. That awareness of cycles becomes another form of leverage. That knowing the shape of collapse leads not to restraint, but to attempts at control disguised as prevention. This is the point where theory must become ethics. Understanding without humility becomes strategy. Strategy accelerates exploitation. Exploitation revives drift. The cycle tightens again. The elders do not intervene here either. Their silence is consistent. They do not appear to correct misinterpretation. They allow misunderstanding to unfold until consequence clarifies what words cannot. This allowance is harsh, but precise. It ensures that wisdom, when it emerges, is grounded in experience rather than abstraction. As this act of interpretation deepens, the narrative edges toward its most precarious question. Not whether ancient civilizations existed, not whether Antarctica hides records, but whether modern humanity, armed with unprecedented insight, can resist turning understanding into control. The answer is not theoretical. It will be expressed through choices already underway, and the cycle, patient as ever, will respond not to intention, but to outcome. Outcome, once set in motion, unfolds without regard for interpretation. This is the moment deep time always returns to, regardless of how sophisticated the analysis becomes. Systems do not respond to narratives. They respond to pressure, to energy added or removed, to balances altered beyond recovery. In the ancient cycles, this stage is often remembered as inevitability, not tragedy imposed from outside, but consequence ripening from within. The point at which choice has narrowed enough that movement continues, even if intention changes. Civilizations at this threshold often feel confused rather than doomed. They possess more knowledge than ever before, yet feel less capable of directing it. The future seems crowded with plans, but empty of certainty. Solutions multiply, but stability does not follow. This confusion is not accidental. It is the cognitive signature of overreach meeting complexity. The elders, in choosing silence, avoided becoming part of this confusion. Had they intervened, their presence would have been interpreted as authority. Authority would have been obeyed or resisted, but not integrated. Either response would have externalized responsibility. Silence forces internal reckoning. Antarctica, distant and unresponsive, mirrors this dynamic. It does not react to debate or belief. It reacts to temperature, to circulation, to cumulative change. Its response is delayed but decisive. When thresholds are crossed, reversal becomes slow and difficult. This delay is often mistaken for forgiveness. It is not. It is inertia. In the myths, this inertia is remembered as the calm before collapse, a deceptive stability that allows excess to finalize itself. When correction arrives, it feels sudden only because attention has been elsewhere. This is where ancient and modern narratives converge most clearly. The language differs, but the pattern is identical. Systems pushed beyond resilience respond with reorganization, not as punishment, but as adjustment. If humanity has reached this stage again, then the role of any inherited wisdom becomes limited. No system, no framework, no archive can reverse accumulated drift instantly. At best, they can shape what survives the adjustment. This reframes the purpose of legacy. Legacy is not about preventing loss. It is about influencing what remains intelligible afterward. If the elders aligned their legacy with deep planetary processes, then they accepted this limitation fully. They did not attempt to freeze history. They allowed it to move, trusting that something essential would endure. That trust may have been their greatest risk, because it assumes that intelligence, given enough cycles, will eventually learn restraint not as doctrine, but as instinct. This learning is slow, painfully slow. It is learned through repetition, through rebuilding, through watching familiar mistakes play out under new names. But it is learned. Antarctica, unchanged, continues to offer context rather than command. It shows what the planet does when energy accumulates or dissipates. It preserves the evidence of prior atmospheres, prior climates, prior equilibria. It does not interpret them. That task belongs to whoever is willing to look without urgency. As the narrative approaches its final act, the focus shifts again, away from catastrophe, away from speculation, and toward inheritance. Not inheritance of technology or territory, inheritance of posture. How does a civilization stand within time when it finally understands that time does not belong to it? The answer will not be declared. It will be lived quietly in choices made while the ice continues to wait. Posture, once inherited, shapes everything that follows without ever announcing itself. A civilization's posture toward time determines how it interprets both power and loss. When time is seen as an enemy, progress becomes a race. When time is seen as a resource, restraint becomes strategy. But when time is seen as a companion, something quieter emerges. Patience stops feeling like delay and begins to feel like alignment. This is the posture the elders may have reached. Not resignation, not despair, but companionship with cycles larger than identity. In this posture, collapse is no longer personal. It is contextual, a change in conditions rather than a verdict on worth. This perspective dissolves the drama that often drives civilizations to overcorrect or cling too tightly to what must pass. The myths that survive resets seem to carry traces of this posture. They do not linger on blame. They do not assign moral failure to the world itself. Instead, they speak of forgetting, imbalance, and renewal. They imply that collapse is not an anomaly, but a phase. This implication is difficult for modern consciousness to absorb. Modern systems are built on continuity. Contracts, institutions, identities all assume persistence. When that assumption is questioned, anxiety rushes in. The instinct is to stabilize at all costs. But deep time teaches a different lesson. Stability achieved through force is brittle. Stability achieved through balance endures. Antarctica, untouched and uncompromising, continues to embody this truth. It does not resist change. It absorbs it. It does not prevent warming or cooling. It responds proportionally. Its power lies not in control, but in coherence with planetary systems. If an inheritance exists there, it is not a warning etched in stone. It is an example expressed through being. The ice does not ask humanity to stop progressing. It asks humanity to notice consequences, to recognize that every action echoes through systems that cannot be negotiated with. This is where reflection must become practice. Not ideology, not doctrine, practice. A way of building that anticipates dismantling. A way of knowing that anticipates forgetting. A way of living that anticipates renewal without clinging to permanence. Such practice is rare. It offers no immediate reward. It produces no monuments. It often looks like inaction to those who equate movement with meaning. Yet over long spans of time, this practice becomes visible through what does not happen, through disasters softened, through collapses that do not fully erase, through recoveries that occur without total loss of orientation. The elders, in withdrawing, may have trusted this invisibility more than visibility. They may have believed that the most reliable influence is the one that leaves no signature. As the narrative approaches its closing movements, this idea becomes central. The question is no longer whether humanity will face another reset. It will. The question is whether the posture carried into that reset will amplify loss or soften it, whether memory will survive as rigidity or as flexibility, whether silence will be filled with panic or with listening. The ice has already chosen its posture. It waits, and in that waiting, it continues to offer humanity the same quiet invitation it always has, not to conquer time, but to stand within it, carefully, long enough to learn how to let go without forgetting who it is. Standing within time requires a different kind of courage, not the courage to advance, but the courage to pause without fear of falling behind. To accept that meaning does not accelerate simply because activity does. To recognize that some truths only become visible when motion slows enough to let them surface. In the final phase of long cycles, civilizations often sense this intuitively. There is a quiet turning inward, not a retreat from the world, but a recalibration of attention. Questions shift from how much can be done to how much should be done. This shift rarely dominates headlines or monuments. It appears in margins, in philosophy, in art, in the subtle revaluation of values. Success is redefined. Legacy is questioned. Continuity begins to matter more than expansion. These are signs not of decline, but of maturation. The elders, if they existed as more than myth, may have reached this stage and recognized its fragility. Maturity is always temporary. It requires constant reinforcement. One generation's insight can dissolve into the next generation's ambition if not carried gently. This is why silence, once again, becomes meaningful. Words age quickly. Examples endure longer. A posture embodied consistently across time teaches more effectively than instruction repeated endlessly. Antarctica continues to embody that posture. It stands as a reminder that influence does not require visibility, that a place can shape the entire planet simply by remaining what it is. That stability can arise from refusal rather than assertion. The ice refuses speed, it refuses convenience, it refuses ownership. And in that refusal, it stabilizes systems far beyond its borders. If humanity is to carry forward anything from this long narrative, it may be this principle, that not all progress is forward motion, that sometimes the most consequential act is choosing not to intervene. As the story approaches its conclusion, the speculative elements fade into the background. The question of what lies beneath the ice becomes less urgent. What matters more is what lies within human behavior itself. Whether restraint can become habitual rather than reactive. Whether listening can outlast fear. Whether silence can be trusted long enough to teach. The elders, if they trusted anything, trusted time. They trusted that intelligence, even when it forgets, eventually remembers the shape of balance. That cycles, repeated often enough, leave grooves deep enough to guide behavior without command. This trust may be the most difficult inheritance to accept, because it asks humanity to relinquish certainty, to act without guarantees, to choose humility without knowing whether it will be rewarded. The ice offers no reassurance. It offers only continuity, and perhaps that is enough. As the final act approaches, the narrative does not prepare for revelation. It prepares for release, for the quiet understanding that the story does not end with answers. It ends with a posture carried forward into whatever cycle comes next. Release, when it arrives, is not an ending. It is a soft loosening of grip, a recognition that the story does not belong to any single age, any single civilization, or any single interpretation. It belongs to the movement itself, to the long arc that carries awareness forward even as forms dissolve. In this final phase of understanding, humanity no longer asks where the elders went. The question loses its urgency. Absence is no longer felt as loss, but as space, room for choice, room for responsibility, room for mistakes that must be owned rather than explained away. The elders, if they ever stood at the same threshold, may have understood this with clarity. To remain present would have been to interfere. To explain too much would have been to anchor meaning to a moment destined to pass. To command would have been to deny the future its own discoveries. So they released the story. They allowed it to fragment, to mythologize, to be misremembered and reassembled in new forms. They trusted that what mattered would survive distortion because it was rooted not in facts, but in patterns. Patterns endure because they repeat. The pattern here is simple and difficult. Civilizations rise toward complexity. They test limits. They strain systems. Correction follows. What survives is what can adapt. What adapts carries forward a faint memory of balance. Over time, that memory deepens. This is not progress in the modern sense. It is refinement. Antarctica remains, as it always has, outside this drama and central to it, a place that holds time without narrating it, that preserves consequence without assigning meaning, that allows each age to encounter its evidence fresh without instruction. The ice does not insist that humanity learn. It only ensures that the lesson is available. As the narrative prepares to close, the question of what lies beneath the ice fades into silence, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer needs to be asked urgently. Whether there are structures, systems, or nothing at all beneath the frozen surface matters less than how humanity behaves on the surface above it. The true archive may not be buried. It may be embodied in how slowly we choose to move when speed is possible, in how carefully we choose to intervene when control is tempting, in how willingly we accept that some knowledge matures only through restraint. This is the inheritance that cannot be excavated. It can only be practiced. As the story releases its grip, it leaves behind no revelation, no command, no final truth. Only a quiet orientation toward time that asks very little and offers something rare. Continuity without certainty, memory without monument, silence without abandonment. And in that silence, the cycle continues, not toward an end, but toward another beginning that will ask the same questions again, in a different voice, under a different sky. The ice will still be there, waiting. The waiting does not feel empty now. After release, silence takes on a different texture. It is no longer filled with anticipation or speculation. It feels complete, like a long breath finally exhaled. The questions that once demanded answers now rest gently, no longer pressing for resolution. In this stillness, humanity becomes aware of something subtle. The story it has been telling itself about beginnings and endings was always incomplete. There are no true beginnings, only reemergences. No true endings, only transitions that feel final from within them. This realization carries a quiet relief. If civilization is not the first, then it is not alone in its uncertainty. If it will not be the last, then its choices matter not because they guarantee permanence, but because they influence tone. The tone of what comes next, the softness or harshness of the next passage. Tone survives longer than structure. The elders, if they ever reached this awareness, may have understood that shaping tone is the deepest form of influence. Tone is not imposed. It is absorbed. It seeps into behavior, into instinct, into what feels natural long after memory fades. Antarctica continues to shape tone simply by existing. Its vast quiet tempers imagination. Its scale humbles ambition. Its endurance reframes urgency. It reminds humanity that some things cannot be rushed, persuaded, or conquered. This reminder does not demand obedience. It invites perspective. In this final movement of the story, reflection turns inward completely. The gaze shifts from ice and myth and lost systems to the present moment, to how time feels now, to whether acceleration feels nourishing or exhausting, to whether silence feels threatening or restorative. These sensations are not trivial. They are signals. A civilization that feels exhausted by its own speed is approaching another threshold. A civilization that fears silence has forgotten how to listen. A civilization that equates stillness with failure is already drifting. Yet awareness of these feelings suggests possibility. Possibility that this cycle might turn slightly differently. Not dramatically. Not enough to prevent all loss, but enough to soften edges, enough to preserve orientation through disruption. The elders' silence does not promise salvation. It offers continuity. Continuity of questions, continuity of pattern, continuity of the opportunity to choose restraint again, even if it was forgotten before. As the story settles into its closing act, it does not ask for belief. It asks for patience, for attention stretched across time rather than focused on outcome. The ice will continue to regulate oceans and winds long after names and borders fade. It will continue to hold layers of atmosphere, quietly compressing memory into form. And humanity, whether it realizes it or not, will continue to respond to those layers, to the rhythms they reflect, to the limits they imply. The inheritance, then, is not hidden under the ice. It is carried forward in how gently the next step is taken, in how carefully the future is approached, knowing that others have walked here before and chosen, at least once, to slow down rather than push ahead. The cycle does not close. It loosens. And in that loosening, something ancient remains awake, waiting to see what tone will be chosen this time. What remains awake after loosening is not vigilance, but awareness without urgency. In this state, humanity no longer strains to decode the past as if it were a locked message. The desire to uncover, to expose, to reveal softens. Curiosity remains, but it is tempered by patience. Questions are allowed to breathe. This is a rare posture. Most ages either rush forward or cling backward. Few pause in the present long enough to sense the texture of time itself. When they do, history stops feeling like a ladder and begins to feel like a tide. Movements recur, but never in exactly the same way. Familiar shapes appear, but with altered edges. This awareness carries humility naturally. If others have stood where we stand now, then our moment is not unique, only specific. Its challenges are shaped by our tools, our scale, our speed. But the underlying tension between balance and excess, restraint and ambition, remains unchanged. Antarctica continues to exist as a reminder of this sameness across difference. Its ice does not belong to any era. It has been accumulating and releasing long before names were given to directions. It will continue to do so long after languages dissolve. In its presence, urgency feels misplaced. And perhaps that is why the idea of something hidden beneath it persists so strongly. Not because there must be an object, but because the human mind seeks permission to slow down. A reason to treat patience as intelligence rather than delay. The ice offers that permission wordlessly. In this near-final stillness of the story, the elders are no longer imagined as beings or civilizations. They dissolve into function. They are the expression of restraint at the edge of capability. They are the choice not to press further simply because it is possible. They are a mirror held up to the present. If humanity feels drawn to this mirror now, it may be because it stands at another edge. One where power has outpaced wisdom just enough to create discomfort. One where the future feels crowded with options, but thin on meaning. The story does not suggest catastrophe as destiny. It suggests correction as rhythm. It suggests that how correction unfolds depends on posture more than preparation. Posture cannot be engineered. It must be cultivated. And cultivation takes time. This is why the final inheritance is quiet. It does not announce itself as knowledge. It feels like instinct rediscovered, like a hesitation before irreversible action, like a question that interrupts certainty just long enough to create space. The ice will not tell humanity what to do. It will continue to respond honestly to what is done. And that honesty, over long enough spans, has always been the truest teacher. As the narrative draws closer to rest, the invitation becomes simple. Not to believe, not to deny, but to notice. To notice how silence feels when it is not filled. To notice how patience changes perception. To notice how time, when treated as companion rather than enemy, reveals patterns that no revelation ever could. The cycle does not ask for resolution. It asks for presence, and presence, held gently enough, may be the only thing that truly survives. Presence, when sustained, changes the meaning of inheritance. Inheritance is no longer imagined as something passed down intact, wrapped in certainty, waiting to be opened at the right moment. It is understood instead as a current, something you step into, feel briefly, and then move through. It shapes you while you are within it, but it does not belong to you. This realization softens the need for conclusions. The ancient question of what lies beneath the ice loses its urgency because it was never the center of the story. The ice was never meant to be solved like a puzzle. It was meant to be encountered like a horizon. Always present, always distant, always shaping direction without revealing destination. Humanity, standing at the edge of another cycle, may finally be able to sense this difference. Not everything that matters is meant to be uncovered. Not everything preserved is meant to be used. Not everything inherited is meant to be understood immediately. Some things exist to slow the hand reaching for control. Antarctica performs this role perfectly. It resists narrative. It resists ownership. It resists haste. Its silence is not empty. It is structured, disciplined, consistent across time. In that consistency, a quiet reassurance emerges. The planet does not forget itself. Even when civilizations do, even when memory fractures, even when ambition accelerates beyond restraint, the world carries its own continuity. This continuity does not guarantee comfort, but it does guarantee context. To live within that context is to accept that intelligence is not defined by dominance, but by relationship, by how well a species learns to listen to systems larger than itself, by how carefully it chooses when to act and when to refrain. The elders, whether imagined as beings, cultures, or accumulated intuition, represent a moment when that relationship was understood deeply enough to choose silence over assertion. That choice echoes still, not as command, as atmosphere. It influences how stories are told, how myths recur, how unease surfaces when limits are crossed, how restraint occasionally reappears, uncelebrated but effective. As the narrative settles into its final movement, there is nothing left to resolve. No secret to reveal, no theory to confirm, only a quiet awareness that the cycle has always included this moment. The moment where attention turns inward, where time slows just enough for choice to widen again. The ice will remain, the questions will return, the answers will never be final. But the posture carried forward from this stillness may shape the tone of what follows more than any discovery ever could. And in that tone, faint but persistent, the inheritance continues, not under the ice, but within the way. The future is approached, step by careful step, as if someone, long ago, chose patience and trusted that it would someday be remembered. The future approaches quietly, as it always has, not as a destination, but as a continuation of motion already underway. It does not arrive fully formed. It gathers itself from small choices, repeated postures, unnoticed hesitations that accumulate into direction. This is where the story finally rests. Not because it has ended, but because it has said everything it can without becoming instruction. Any further explanation would diminish what silence has already offered. If there was once a civilization that understood cycles deeply enough to step back, then its greatest act was not preservation, but trust. Trust that meaning does not require guardianship forever. Trust that intelligence, even when it forgets, retains the capacity to remember again. Antarctica remains as quiet proof of that trust. A continent that belongs to no one, yet influences everyone. A place where time thickens, slows, and becomes visible in layers. A reminder that endurance does not depend on being known. The ice does not care whether it is mythologized or ignored. It responds only to balance. It records only what is real. It waits without expectation. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that waiting does not mean passivity, that silence does not mean emptiness, that absence does not mean abandonment. Some legacies are strongest when they refuse to speak. As humanity continues forward, it will face familiar tensions under unfamiliar conditions. New tools, new scales, new risks. But beneath those changes, the same questions will surface again, as they always do. How far is too far? When is enough? What must be left untouched? The answers will not come from the ice. They will come from the posture brought to it. If the story has done anything at all, it has only slowed the moment long enough for that posture to be noticed, long enough to sense that the mystery was never meant to be solved, only respected. The cycle continues. The planet breathes. The ice waits. And somewhere within that waiting, the quiet memory of restraint remains, patient enough to outlast forgetting, ready to be recognized whenever humanity chooses, once again, to listen rather than rush. Nothing more needs to be said. The rest belongs to time.